Chapter 1. A cold wind blew in a ruined temple on the outskirts of the city. Gong Yimo, where do you think you can escape to? A cold and hoarse male voice came slowly. It was calm, but it sounded like there was sand in his throat, which made people feel uncomfortable. A cold wind blew, blowing the wooden windows of the ruined temple. A silver-black figure stepped in steadily. As the corners of his clothes fluttered, the dragon embroidered with dark red thread and golden thread on it was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. When it fluttered, it was very lifelike, as if it was about to come alive. One could see the whole picture just by looking at a corner. Such exquisiteness was incompatible with this ruined temple that was on the verge of collapse. Following him was a group of well-trained moon dragon guards in silver-white soft armor. They moved an armchair into the temple with light steps. When the man sat down, they quickly sealed off all the directions of the ruined temple. The whole process was silent, but there was a chilling aura that made it impossible for people to escape. What a group of elites, what a regent! With a low cough, a heavily injured woman let out an unsteady smile. Her appearance was very tragic. It could be said that if it was anyone else standing here, they would not be able to bear to see her like this. With nowhere else to go, she dismissed the person who brought her here and sat alone on the ground of the ruined temple, waiting for his arrival. Her martial arts were crippled and her limbs were broken. She was tortured in the regent's death row prison for half a month. Finally, after exhausting all her connections and financial resources, she managed to escape with great difficulty. However, she did not expect that she would still be found by him here. She could still smile in such a situation. This made the man who was sitting upright and cold as ice think highly of her. Gong Dai, speaking of which, you have to call me royal sister. Her voice was extremely hoarse. When she raised her head, a pair of cold star-like eyes were revealed through her messy hair, and there was a hint of mockery. Gong Dai smiled coldly, and a trace of mockery flashed across his extremely handsome face. He raised his head and looked down at her from above, revealing an inexplicable majesty and coldness. Royal sister? I only know that if she wants you to die, you must die. Unexpectedly, his words made Gong Yimo laugh until she was out of breath. She coughed and gasped for breath, and a trace of malice flashed in her eyes. So, if she wants another man, you will send her to that man's bed? Her words caused Gong Yi's cold eyes to widen, and a chill that seemed to have materialized spread out, causing the others present to not even dare to breathe loudly. Gong Dai casually waved his hand and Gong Yimo felt a wave of energy attack her. She was slapped to the side and spat out a mouthful of blood. There were dark bruises in the blood, making it a ghastly sight. You're courting death. The current Gong Yimo had nothing. She was an existence that could be destroyed with a wave of his hand. Pain. His entire body was in pain. Gong Yimo knew that with her injuries, even if Gong Dai didn't come, she wouldn't be able to survive, however. He was really fucking unwilling to accept this. She wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and said angrily, "What? Did I say something wrong? Sometimes I really don't know if you really like her. I only know that I like Gong Che. Yes, I definitely won't allow him to have other women." At this point, without waiting for Gong Dai's cold murderous intent to explode, she became dispirited. It was as if the mention of that person had drained her of her vitality. She suddenly fell silent and laughed bitterly. Her laughter echoed in the rundown temple, making it sound especially desolate. After a moment, she muttered to herself, "Perhaps this is why I ended up like this, but you're still fine." I've heard people say that the highest level of love is to fulfill one's wish. However, when she thought about the word fulfill, she felt even more disgusted. She was highly skilled in martial arts and possessed the dimension. She could have led a happy life, but for that man, she tried her best to change her name and marry him. In order to help him, she did many things that went against her conscience. She even moved many technologies that didn't belong to this era, causing countless tragedies. She helped him kill people, risked her life, and was willing to give up everything. However, she didn't expect him to kick her away after achieving his goal. He even said that all of this was because of her ambition, that she wanted to achieve hegemony. He said that she was vicious and evil, and that he had always loved another pure and kind woman. Ridiculous, ridiculous. Who did she become like this for? She didn't want to kill people. She used to be a pure and kind woman. She even remembered that Gong Che hugged that woman and said to her in a patronizing tone, "Lan Er has helped me a lot. She's gentle and kind, and is my most beloved woman. In the past, you schemed against Lan Er and even caused her to lose her child, but I didn't hold it against you. If you know what's good for you, please step down and I will grant you the position of imperial concubine." The emperor's grace was vast and mighty. Even after the empress stepped down, she could still hold the position of imperial concubine. Unfortunately, he misjudged her, Gong Yimo, and also misjudged a gentle and kind woman called Su Miaolan. When she heard that Gong Che even gave her the position of imperial concubine after she had framed and smeared his name, she already had murderous intent in her heart. So after she schemed against her and threw her into the cold palace, she asked Gong Dai, who was infatuated with her, to kill her. Moreover, she didn't kill her directly, but wanted her to suffer all kinds of torture before dying. What a gentle and kind woman. Gong Yimo couldn't help but look at her own hands. Her fingers had been tortured and were broken. Half of her feet, which were wrapped in straw sandals, were exposed, and even her toes had been broken off. They were suppurating and flowing with black pus and blood. Other than the marks of firecrackers on her body, she had also suffered 108 cuts of 1,000 cuts. She was already a lamp that had run out of oil and was not far from death. She was just holding on to her last breath, unwilling to die in Gong Dai's hands. She wanted no one to be able to find her, so that Su Miaolan wouldn't be able to sleep in peace. Unfortunately, how could she be a match for the Prince Regent who was known as the Dark Emperor? Have you said enough? If you've said enough, then die. Gong Dai sneered angrily. With a wave of his hand, the sword behind him was unsheathed, easily deciding her life and death. It seemed that there was no way to escape. Gong Yimo subconsciously looked at the lotus pattern on her finger and smiled bitterly. She hated the fact that she had crossed over to this place. There was only space, but space couldn't contain any living things. Otherwise, how could she be reduced to this? She used to think that she, who had space and martial arts, would be the favored girl of this space-time. She didn't expect that Su Miaolan, who had the two strongest men in this space-time, would be the one. It was a pity that she had done so much, but it was all in vain. She even ended up dying a tragic death. She really couldn't accept it, until the sword pierced Gong Yimo's throat. Gong Dai's mouth revealed a trace of a smile. This way, that woman should be satisfied, right? Blood flowed like a river. At the last moment, Gong Yimo's eyes reflected the benevolent and compassionate smile of the Bodhisattva sitting on the throne. If there was a next life, she would never love anyone again. Chapter 2. Pain. Blood flowed from her neck. She originally thought that her blood should have been drained a long time ago. She didn't expect that there would be so much blood. She didn't know how long it would take for her to suffocate and die. This kind of pain was enough to be remembered for a lifetime. Gong Yimo suddenly woke up. She covered her neck with her hand and gasped for breath. The suffocating feeling in her dream came back again. It was as if it was branded into her bones and became a lifelong nightmare. Looking at the desolate, cold palace in front of her, Gong Yimo was in a trance. Yes, she had been reborn for 3 days. In the last second of her life, she seemed to see the lotus mark on her finger glowing. Then, she returned to the time when she was 7 years old, before she escaped from the cold palace. As for why she was in the cold palace, it was a long story. This country was similar to the Tang dynasty in another time and space. History diverged during the Han dynasty, and finally created the current Daiyu State dynasty. It had been prosperous for 2 generations, and now it was the 3rd generation. After the first generation, which had many things to do, and the second generation, which had developed and expanded, the current Daiyu State dynasty was unprecedentedly prosperous. The king, Emperor Chengcheng, was in the prime of his life. He had unlimited energy and was at the age where he could achieve great things. After ascending the throne for more than 10 years, he had conquered several surrounding small countries, expanded the territory, spread the prestige of the country, and made immortal contributions. He was praised by everyone as a wise king. He loved the country and loved beauties. This king who sat on the world was very focused on women. The former king sat on 3,000 beauties, and his harem had a total of 30,000 people. Moreover, there was a trend of expansion. He especially liked women that he snatched. Gong Yimo's mother was snatched by Emperor Cheng Cheng. Different from the previous spoils of war, when he snatched Shuoyan, she was already a month pregnant. At first, the king was busy returning to the court, so he didn't notice. By the time he found out, it was already too late. Emperor Cheng Cheng didn't care about the chastity of the woman he snatched, but it was absolutely shameful for her to have a child. Therefore, he ordered Shuoyan, who was the newly conferred Xue Fei, to abort the child. However, Xue Fei threatened him with death and swore that she would die. To everyone's surprise, Emperor Cheng, who had always been strong, actually gave in. In the end, he issued an injunction to silence all those who knew the truth. He then recognized the daughter she gave birth to and named her Emo. This was definitely not the name of a princess, but rather the name of a powerful man. He was using this name to declare his love to the stubborn little woman. He, the emperor of a generation, sat on the throne of 30,000 beauties, and he actually wanted to be with one of them. Under Gong Emo's name, Xue Fei's favor reached its peak. Unfortunately, Gong Emo was not a scheming woman. Even under Emperor Emo's strict guard, Gong Emo ultimately failed to escape the empress's schemes. When Gong Emo was 3 years old, she was poisoned and died. Before she died, she told her daughter the truth that she was not the emperor's biological daughter. After losing her beloved mother, little Gong Emo became extremely unpopular overnight because of her special identity. Emperor Cheng Cheng refused to see her, and the other concubines who were jealous of Xue Fei were happy to hit her when she was down. The little princess had no favor and no family. After being banished to the cold palace, she fell ill in less than 2 months. In her previous life, she also transmigrated to this world when she was 3 years old. But in this life, she transmigrated 4 years later. In her previous life, she was very lucky. Soon after she woke up, she met her master who came to Dayu State to visit. She was accepted as a disciple and was taken to Yunding Mountain. Now, she was reborn at the age of 7. She missed the opportunity to meet her master. Moreover, in the inherited memory, the princess was sick in the cold palace for 4 years. It can be imagined how weak she was now. After thinking for a long time, her stomach was a little hungry. She was a child, so she couldn't bear to be hungry. She pinched her thin and weak arms and extremely malnourished and yellow face. Well, not to mention the tight and healthy muscles, she was just skin and bones. Looking at the leftovers on the table, Gong Yimo sighed. She lifted the dark and hard quilt and jumped out of bed. She found a pair of shoes that didn't fit her feet and carefully walked out. The place she lived in was exquisitely carved and painted, but the cold palace was still a cold palace. Other than beautiful roof tiles and a pitiful few palace servants, there was nothing else. The cold palace was also divided by a palace alley. The cold palace on the right side of the alley was for the concubines and palace maids. On the left side of the alley lived the imperial children who made mistakes and weren't favored. But in her previous life, she didn't live in the cold palace for long before her master took her away. She didn't know who her neighbors were. After searching for a long time, she finally stole some food and water from the residence of the nanny in charge of the cold palace. Gong Yimo walked back with a steamed bun in her mouth while thinking about life. God still treated her well. In addition, before transmigrating, she had already lived 2 lives. Although she died young in both lives and died tragically, in this third life, she had the advantage of time and place. It really couldn't be justified if she still couldn't die of old age. What should she do in the future? Revenge? In terms of hatred and unwillingness, she definitely had it. But it really wasn't worth it to sacrifice her third life for those scumbags. If there was a chance in the future, she would take revenge, but she definitely wouldn't take revenge for the sake of revenge. Leave? In this life, she transmigrated late and didn't meet her master. Moreover, the palace was heavily guarded. She was small and weak, and without outside help, it was impossible for her to escape alone. Moreover, human trafficking was legal in ancient times. She didn't have the ability to protect herself now, so it wasn't a good thing to go out. Then there was only Gong Yimo looked at the center of the bustling palace in the distance and thought to herself, no matter what, the most important thing was to pick up martial arts. Just as she was thinking, she suddenly heard an angry scolding. Gong Yimo moved and hid in a corner. Listening carefully, it didn't seem like the person was scolding her. She struggled to climb up a tree and looked inside the palace wall. She raised her eyebrows slightly. She didn't expect that there were other siblings in the cold palace besides her. Well, this emperor could be Reborn. Who was so unlucky to be here? Do you still think that you're that high and mighty prince? Hey, let me tell you, in this place, I am the law. If I tell you to drink, you must drink. A sharp voice sounded. Gong Yimo saw an old eunuch wearing a low-level eunuch uniform grabbing a little boy's collar. Although he looked fierce, it wasn't hard to see the nervousness in his expression. The hand holding the bowl was tightly clenched, and a lot of medicine spilled out. A beautiful little boy wearing a brocade robe that was obviously too small was thrown to the ground by him. His large eyes were filled with stubbornness, but because of malnutrition, his thin face was very pale, so even if he glared at people, it didn't have any killing power. Castrated dog. The child's voice was hoarse and tender, but the words he said were infuriating. Chapter 3. You're scolding me. The old eunuch glared angrily. Wasn't the word castrated dog scolding him? He stared at the eunuch with resentment and suddenly sneered. Weren't you stubborn? He had to ruthlessly humiliate him. Calling me a castrated dog? How good are you? You're just a little beast that no one wants. Why? Are you still waiting for Xiao Dai, that girl, to come back? As soon as he finished speaking, the little boy's eyes lit up. However, he heard the eunuch say maliciously, Stop dreaming. She's now climbing up another branch. She won't remember someone like you. Do you think she's sincere towards you? But you're still a prince. Following you can make a meteoric rise. Now that His Majesty hasn't thought of you for 2 years, you've lost your value. Why won't you let her go? The old eunuch's words finally angered the vigilant and sensitive little boy. He glared fiercely at the eunuch. His voice was hoarse and childish. Xiao Dai won't. She said she won't leave me. Xiao Dai had once received great kindness from his mother. How could she abandon him so easily? Ha ha ha, a fine bird chooses a tree to nest in. What's wrong with that? Do you want me to die with you? Quickly drink this medicine. Perhaps I'll be happy and spare your little life. That one sentence made the little boy's eyes filled with sadness and cold hatred. He glared at the old eunuch in front of him, who was wearing a bandage. He hated everyone. When his mother died, he was framed and banished to the cold palace. Overnight, the world was turned upside down and he suffered both cold and warm. In the harem, those who served him would either torture him in every possible way, or be taken away as scapegoats when he was seriously injured. Those who were good to him would also inexplicably die for various reasons. However, he didn't expect that Xiao Dai, who had received great kindness from his mother, would also leave him in just a month. For a time, no matter how tenacious his mind was, he couldn't help but feel resentment and fear towards this world, and he even had a feeling of being abandoned by his friends and family. Now, the little fellow was forcefully restraining himself, and only then was he able to prevent the uneasiness at the bottom of his heart from exploding out. But he never imagined that this wasn't enough, and those people even brazenly forced him to take poison. Gong Yimo, who was peeping at the side, originally broke out in a cold sweat for the child. However, when she saw who the little boy was, she didn't have the mood to help him. She only felt a burning rage. Damn it, it's him. Gong Dai. She could recognize him even if he turned into ashes, let alone just him. At this moment, his lips were tightly pursed. His eyes were filled with determination and anger. However, his hands revealed his fear and uneasiness. No matter how outstanding he was still only 6 years old. No matter how outstanding he was only 6 years old. That weak body, he couldn't do anything. However, No matter how pitiful he was now, it couldn't hide how cruel he would be in the future. Those tortures were still vivid in his mind. It was a shadow she couldn't forget for the rest of her life. Gong Yimo's eyes flashed fiercely. She was thinking, should she kill this boy before he killed her? Seeing that little Gong Dai didn't obey, the old eunuch became anxious. This matter was supposed to be carried out secretly. It couldn't be delayed any longer. Thus, he suddenly stepped forward and grabbed Gong Dai's hands and feet. He didn't expect that this eunuch was also a martial artist. Although Gong Dai had some martial arts training, he was still young and malnourished. He was restrained by the eunuch in a few moves. Even so, most of the medicine had been spilled. The old eunuch was furious. His eyes flashed with ruthlessness. You actually refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. As he said that, he punched and kicked little Gong Dai. He purposely chose places that hurt but couldn't see. After being beaten to this state, the 6-year-old Gong Dai gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound. After venting his anger, the old eunuch pinched his chin. He cursed and forced the small bowl of medicine down his throat. No. The child's black jade-like eyes were wide open. They were filled with unwillingness and fear. Although he didn't know what it was definitely not something good. But he couldn't struggle and could only swallow it down. He hated that he was too weak. Too weak. Why? He had already lost everything. Why was it not enough for those people to harm his mother? Why did they want to harm him? Gong Yimo, who was hiding in the dark, couldn't help but move when she saw little Gong Dai being beaten. When she saw him being forced to drink medicine, she felt even more upset. Gong Dai, Gong Dai, I didn't expect that you would have such a miserable time. Before she died, she was tortured by this man. The more she screamed, the happier this man was. He was a living example of a psychopath. It must be because he was tortured in every possible way in his childhood that he became so psychopathic when he grew up. But now, he was just a child who had no power at all. Gong Yimo's heart was in a dilemma. On one hand, she felt that she should kill the person who killed her in the cradle. On the other hand, she felt that he was still a child. He was already in such a miserable state, so he shouldn't be blamed for things he hadn't done. Seeing that the medicine had been forced down, the old eunuch sighed in relief. Looking at the child who was clutching his neck and curling up on the ground, looking as pitiful as a dog, he felt a sense of pleasure in his heart. So what if he was a prince or a descendant of the imperial family? Wasn't he still being squashed by this rootless child? Who asked you to not be tactful? Why did you have to suffer? Don't worry, that medicine won't kill you. It will only turn you into a mute and a cripple for the rest of your life. You actually dared to say that concubine Xian framed you. You deserve to be forced to drink medicine. After saying that, he kicked the child twice and spat on the ground before quickly running away. His words made little Ju's body tremble, and his pair of dark eyes filled with resentment. He had only told Xiao Dai that concubine Xian framed him. He didn't expect that the other party had relied on his words to climb up the social ladder. This human heart, this harem. Indeed, only the most ruthless people can survive. Seeing that he had gone far away, Gong Yimo jumped out. She recalled that it was rumored that the bloodthirsty Yama King, the regent who had a large military force, was banished to the cold palace when he was 4 years old. He was even poisoned and became mute. His life was very miserable. Later, when he gained power, he met a divine doctor and his throat was cured. However, Gong Yimo knew that although his throat was cured, whenever he spoke, it was as painful as being cut by a knife. His voice was also very unpleasant to the ear. Later, when Su Miaolon found out about this matter, she often stewed loquat soup for him. To save or not to save him. She was unwilling to save him, but if she didn't save him, she couldn't bear to. According to the development, Gong Dai would be tortured in the cold palace for a few more years. He would only be released at the age of 13. Even if she didn't save him, he wouldn't die. But when she saw the child in front of her clutching his neck, his thin and frail body curled up into a small ball, and the pain in his throat caused him to whimper like a weak kitten, Gong Yimo couldn't bear to see him like this. She walked out from the shadows. Gong Dai sensed that someone was approaching. and his first reaction was to raise his guard. Chapter 4. He was really scared. In the cold palace, everyone wanted to kill him to get a reward from the higher-ups, but they didn't dare to kill him openly. In addition, the people around him had either died, escaped, or betrayed him, so he was afraid of anyone getting close to him. But he was really uncomfortable. All the bones in his body felt like they were cracked, and his throat felt like it was on fire. He didn't want to become a mute. "Come on, let go of me." The childish voice was very rude, and the attitude was really not good. But when he heard that it was a girl's voice, little Gong Dai narrowed his eyes and quickly glanced at her. His heart suddenly relaxed. She must be the royal sister who was banished to the cold palace back then. She was also a target of persecution because she had no use value and didn't belong to any power. She had no reason to harm me. In the 2 years since he was banished to the cold palace, he had never seen this royal sister. It was rumored that she was sick in bed all year round. He thought that she was already dead, but he didn't expect her to still be alive. When Gong Yimo saw that he had let go of her, she used force to make him lie on her knees. Then, without saying anything, she directly opened his mouth with her hands and desperately clawed at his throat to make him vomit. After all, he was still young, and his throat was delicate and couldn't be stimulated. Gong Dai quickly vomited the medicine, but it wasn't over yet. Gong Yimo took out the water that she had stolen previously and made him drink it. After drinking it, she continued to make him vomit. After repeating this several times, the little boy's face was as white as gold paper, and his lips were pale. Seeing him in such a miserable state, Gong Yimo felt very happy. But when Gong Dai opened his watery eyes and looked at her, there was a trace of vigilance and gratitude in his eyes. He looked at her like a little deer, and it made her feel a little sympathetic. When she was trying to make him vomit earlier, the bones in his body hurt. Even though he was clearly in a worse state than her, he still cleaned himself up neatly. Even though he was wearing clothes that were not suitable for him, he was still clean and white. It was really hard to dislike such a child. Her sympathy only lasted for a moment. She originally wanted to leave him alone. After all, she had done what she could. If he became mute, then it would be fate. However, when she thought of the loquat soup that Su Miaolon would stew every day, she closed her eyes and painfully took out disinfectant tablets and throat-soothing syrup from her space. After thinking for a while, she gritted her teeth and left behind some water and food that she had spent a long time searching for. Every item in the space was used up a little. This was really too convenient for this scourge. Little Gong Dai had been beaten up, drugged, and tortured for a long time. Coupled with the severe pain in his throat, he couldn't speak at all. He could only sit on the ground and watch as the thin royal sister magically took out a lot of things from her sleeves and placed them in front of him. Then, she made him eat the strange white pills and black syrup. He didn't understand. He clearly hated people getting close to him and definitely wouldn't eat things of unknown origin. However, when she impolitely handed him the pills and made him eat them, the impatient look in her eyes made him strangely feel a trace of joy. He actually didn't hesitate to take them and eat them. The strange thing was that when the sweet syrup entered his throat, the burning sensation in his throat instantly faded away. He tried it and could vaguely make a few broken sounds. "Okay, don't talk first." The little girl's expression was very conflicted. She looked left and right and refused to look at him. She only saw her stuffing the entire bottle of syrup into his hand and speaking quickly. "If your throat feels uncomfortable, drink it. You're not allowed to tell anyone about me. I'll leave the food here. That's it. I'll never see you again." The last few words were said especially angrily. "Oh." Little Gong Dai anxiously made a sound. Gong Yimo turned around and frowned impatiently. "Is there anything else?" Gong Dai widened his large black, jade-like eyes. His pale little face was so anxious that it was sweating. He pointed at Gong Yimo and then at himself, saying with difficulty, "Name, your name." When Gong Yimo was banished to the cold palace, Gong Dai was only 2 years old. He didn't even know the name of this royal sister. Now, he was very anxious. He wanted to know the name of the person who saved him. Ming? Gong Yimo's thin and yellow little face scrunched up. Was this fellow asking her if she would come tomorrow? She immediately frowned. She originally wanted to mock him for being insatiable. However, when she saw him carefully tugging at her sleeve and sitting on the ground with a body full of injuries, looking at her with a pair of large eyes, looking like he wanted to come closer but was afraid, she really couldn't bear to be ruthless. Gong Yimo wanted to pry his hand away, but she raised it and put it down again. In the end, she wanted to slap herself. "I'll come tomorrow." After saying that, she quickly pulled up her sleeve, turned around, and ran away. Little Gong Dai felt a piercing pain in his body the moment he moved. He couldn't shout and could only watch as this thin and weak royal sister ran away as if she was being chased by a ghost. She had no choice. Whenever she thought about how the first thing she did after her rebirth was to save the evil person who had tortured her to death in her previous life, she felt so angry that she wanted to strangle herself to death. After a long search, she finally found her room. She angrily threw herself onto the bed. Forget it. If she couldn't figure out a problem, she would just sleep it off. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by the sound of thunder and lightning. Gong Yimo squinted her eyes and touched her cold shoulders. She gradually woke up. This blanket was too thin and had been used for too long. It didn't have any warmth. Unfortunately, she had everything in her space except for a cotton blanket. The rain poured down and the early spring was cold. The entire palace was bleak and cold. It really was the cold palace. She couldn't help but sympathize with her body. She was thrown here at the age of 3, in a place where the emperor didn't care and the palace servants didn't care. If she was really a child, how could she survive? No wonder she was sick for 4 years. However, she was considered good. As a princess who was banished to the cold palace, she didn't have any relatives and wouldn't harm anyone's interests. The palace also didn't care about her life or death. However, it was different for a prince. Gong Dai's maternal family was Zhenshi of Gojoseon, far away in the northwest. They had almost no contact with the capital. Zhenshi of Gojoseon's daughter, Li Qinghua, was Gong Dai's mother. Li Qinghua was beautiful, gentle, and virtuous. Although she was far inferior to Empress Shui at that time, she was still quite favored. It was said that she was once on good terms with Empress Shui. However, no one expected her to be as short-lived as Empress Shui. She died just like Empress Shui, leaving behind a child who hadn't grown up. Therefore, for some of the concubines who had princes, it wasn't enough for Gong Dai to be banished to the cold palace. It was also not enough for him to be crippled. It would be best if he died in the cold palace without anyone knowing. Then, even if Zhenshi of Gojoseon came back, he wouldn't be able to find the murderer. Could he blame the emperor? She didn't know how Gong Dai survived in the cold palace in her previous life and left at the age of 13. His mental fortitude was really terrifying. No wonder he became so abnormal later on. Chapter 5. A flash of lightning lit up half of the palace. The thunder that followed gave Gong Yimo a fright. She looked out of the window and couldn't help but think, that child was severely beaten, and she didn't know if he could walk. What if he fainted after she left? Wouldn't that mean that he was drenched in the rain for half the night? As for the palace servants in the cold palace, she didn't think about them at all. She had been reborn for 3 days, and the palace servants who delivered food only came 3 times. No wonder she was so thin. Gong Yimo tossed and turned. The more she thought about it, the more she couldn't sleep. On one hand, she thought that the scourge wouldn't die, and he could still get out alive. On the other hand, she thought about what would happen if a child really got drenched in the rain, had a fever, and his injured throat got inflamed. Wouldn't her efforts be in vain? No matter what, she couldn't leave any chance for Su Miaolon to improve her favorability. Hence, Gong Yimo flipped over like a carp and went out in the rain. The cold palace at night was quite scary under the heavy rain, thunder, and lightning. Gong Yimo wiped the rain off her face and looked at the place where Gong Dai lived. She didn't expect to come here twice in a day. Her mood was very complicated. Why didn't she have an umbrella in her space? She went forward gloomily and pushed the door open. She glanced at the courtyard and saw that there was no one, so she walked into the house. Unexpectedly, she tripped as soon as she entered the house. There was a little person lying on the ground. Who else could it be other than Gong Dai? Gong Yimo was taken aback and quickly reached out to touch him. The child's body was wet, but his body temperature was very hot. It seemed that he had been hit quite hard today. He must have fainted or couldn't move. He must have woken up in the rain and climbed into the house by himself. Gong Yimo couldn't bear to think of a little child being beaten, drugged, drenched in the rain, and finally crawling into the house by himself. She touched his forehead again, and sure enough, he had a fever. With no time to think, Gong Yimo finally managed to drag Gong Dai onto the bed after using all her strength. She had no choice. She had only been reborn for a few days, and her body was already as thin as a feather. What strength could she possibly have? There was no light in the room, and cold steam filled the air. Gong Yimo shivered and touched her arm. Fortunately, there was a flashlight in the space, or she would have been blinded. His body was burning very badly. Even though she knew that he would not die, Gong Yimo could not bear to see him continue burning like this. She pinched Gong Dai's burning face and sighed deeply. "You're really lucky." In a daze, Gong Dai felt a very bright light. It was clearly night, but it illuminated the area under the bed as if it was daytime. Then, he felt that there was someone beside him. His body tensed up uncontrollably. He had a splitting headache, but his hand slowly reached under the pillow. He wanted to reach for the stone that he had sharpened. At this moment, he heard the other party's rather muffled voice. "You're so annoying. Why don't I have what I need, but you have what you need?" When he heard that it was his royal sister's voice, his body relaxed. He did not understand why he would so easily believe a person he had only met once. Soon, he felt a bitter medicinal liquid being poured into his mouth. He didn't want to swallow it at first, but when he thought about how difficult it must have been to get this medicine from the cold palace, he forced himself to swallow it. It was so bitter that his entire face scrunched up. Gong Yimo was happy when she saw this. She had dissolved the medicine in water for him to drink, so she knew how bitter it was. But when she saw that Gong Dai was unhappy, she felt happy. Then, Gong Dai felt that the other party was taking off his clothes. Even though he was in a daze, he still felt embarrassed. His mother had said that men and women should not be in the same room when they were 7 years old, let alone when they were naked. However, he was burning up and did not have any strength. He could only pretend to be asleep so that the other party would not feel embarrassed. When his clothes were taken off, Gong Yimo sucked in a breath of cold air. It turned out that other than the hands and feet that were exposed, the little boy's body was covered in wounds. Other than some old wounds and bruises, most of them were not obvious internal injuries. But Gong Yimo, who had suffered these injuries, knew how painful those small wounds were. There were many ways to kill people in the palace without spilling blood. She did not expect that in the cold palace, they would also do such a vicious thing to a child. She pursed her lips, feeling very angry. On one hand, she felt that the child in front of her was very pitiful. On the other hand, she thought about how he would inflict these injuries on her body one by one in the future. She felt that he was detestable, but even detestable people had their pitiful sides. Gong Yimo sighed again and touched her space. She had brought a lot of medicine. Because she had been traveling outside all year round, these were all necessities. Now that they had come in handy, it was good that she used them on him. In her previous life, because of these medicines, she had caused a lot of trouble. In this life, she had to be more careful. Gong Dai was feeling uncomfortable from the cold pain when he suddenly felt a cooling sensation from the wounds on his body. He used to be a noble prince, so how could he not know how precious these miraculous medicines were? His heart was shaken. He did not understand why this royal sister, whom he had never met before, was treating him like this. Could it be that she hoped that he would regain his favor and then leave the cold palace? Then she might be disappointed, little Gong Dai thought sadly. It took her more than 10 minutes to apply the medicine all over his body. Then, she took out a bathrobe from her space and wrapped him up. Of the clothes in her space, only a bathrobe was suitable. Feeling the other party's gentle wrapping and the light fragrance of the soft clothes on his body, he felt dizzy and did not have the energy to think about where these things came from. But on this stormy night, this bright light and warmth was enough for him to remember for the rest of his life. In these 2 years, no one had ever treated him so well. No one had ever reminded him of his mother. It was a long, long time ago. Feeling that the other party was packing up, he quickly pretended that he had just woken up and opened his eyes. But when he saw the other party's appearance, he could no longer hold it in. Gong Yimo had been so focused on fiddling with him that she had forgotten that she was also drenched. In addition, she was thin and weak to begin with. Her face was yellow and her clothes were thin. Being drenched like this, she looked as pitiful as an ugly duckling. "Why are you?" Gong Ju's mouth twitched. He wanted to speak, but because of the injury to his throat, he couldn't speak. His big black and white eyes silently stared at her, full of disbelief and uneasiness. He didn't expect that someone would treat him so well even though he was in such a state. He was afraid that this kind of kindness was fake. Seeing that he had woken up, Gong Yimo thought of what he would do in the future. But seeing him in such a small state, she could not bear to do it. Suppressing her anger, she said angrily, "It's good that you're awake. I'm leaving." "Wait." Little Gong Dai was anxious. His body moved, and he almost fell off the bed. Fortunately, Gong Yimo was quick enough to catch him. Her eyes were filled with anger. Chapter 6. What are you doing? Do you know how much effort I put in to get you onto the bed? Little Gong Dai shrank his neck after being scolded by Gong Yimo, but he did not feel humiliated or afraid. Children were the most sensitive to emotions. He seemed to feel that this royal sister was hostile towards him, but she was a kind person, so he did not put his guard up against her. "Thank you." He grabbed Gong Yimo's wet clothes. His black, jade-like big eyes were red like a little rabbit's, and there was a little uneasiness and guilt. His voice had not recovered, and he slowly said in a very soft child's voice, "Thank you, royal sister." The words "royal sister" made Gong Yimo's expression change for no reason. She actually felt a strange sense of refreshment. She finally could not keep a straight face and became smug, and the villain in her heart howled to the sky. Who would have thought that the regent, who killed his father and brother in the future, who washed the harem with blood, who killed people like scything flax, would now pitifully call her royal sister? Who would have thought? Seeing that her expression had eased, Gong Dai clearly felt where the other party's joy came from. Although it was strange, he hurriedly called her royal sister again, as anxious as a little deer, pitiful and cute. Gong Yimo was very happy to hear him call her royal sister. Looking at the little boy in front of her, she did not feel that he was an eyesore anymore. He was quite well behaved when he was young. "You're smart." Gong Yimo smiled coldly and prepared to leave. Suddenly, the sound of a stomach growling sounded. Little Gong Dai's entire face turned red, and he looked at her shyly while holding his stomach. The food she left behind was still in the courtyard, and it was probably not edible now, because food was very rare in the cold palace. Little Gong Dai sensibly did not open his mouth even though he was very hungry. However, his body did not listen to him, and it made him feel very ashamed. Gong Yimo naturally heard it as well. Her expression softened slightly. Although she was still expressionless, she took out a steamed bun from her sleeve again. Although it was cold, Gong Dai hadn't eaten such a clean steamed bun for a long time. Gong Yimo sighed as if she had accepted her fate. She sat by his bedside and took out a bottle of water. She tore open a steamed bun and fed it to the child bit by bit. Her movements were very stiff and careful. It was obvious that she did not know how to take care of a child. Therefore, he gulped down a mouthful of water with every mouthful. Little Gong Dai was really starving. In such a quiet, cold palace, only the sound of him swallowing could be heard. His large eyes were slightly narrowed, as if wondering if this was a dream. Gong Yimo's fingertips were slightly cold. She was clearly impatient, but her movements were very gentle. Every time she fed him, her fingers would come into contact with Gong Dai's warm lips. That small mouth was dry and soft, causing her heart to tremble slightly every time she touched it. This was real. The Gong Dai in front of him was really just a child. But so what? The warmth did not last long. Gong Dai patted his clean hands. Seeing that little Gong Dai still wanted to say something, he quickly stopped him. Gong Yimo deliberately ignored the other party's pair of black, jade-like eyes. She turned her head and looked away with a cold expression. "All right, Don't say anything. This cold palace is full of danger. I can't help you. In the future, you'll have to take care of yourself. It was one thing to feel moved and sympathize with him, but Gong Yimo knew that she would not be a saint to help a person who had tortured and killed her in her previous life. Moreover, Gong Dai had his own path. He was destined to be lonely on the path of the strong. He was not someone who walked the same path as her. After she finished speaking, she saw the child's expression become terrified. She did not care if the other party had anything else to say. She turned around and ran away. Little Gong Dai's raised hand paused slightly. His small mouth opened, but in the end, he did not say anything. He suppressed the disappointment in his heart, and a hurt expression flashed across his large eyes. This royal sister of his probably did not want to get involved in trouble like him. Unfortunately, he did not know her name. In the morning, Gong Yimo cultivated her inner strength for 4 hours before slowly waking up. Every time she finished cultivating her inner strength, she felt refreshed. Last night, she got a fever from the rain, but she immediately recovered. In this life, she started cultivating a little late, but after all, she had cultivated once. Once again, she could cultivate each joint with ease. If this continued, in a few years, she would be able to pick up all her internal energy. At this time, the door of her cold palace was rudely pushed open. A palace maid walked in with a face full of anger. She slammed the food box on the table and said angrily, "Little sickly brat, why aren't you dead yet?" The moment she came in, Gong Yimo was already lying down. She remembered this palace maid. This was the third palace maid assigned to take care of her. The previous two paid a huge price to change positions. Well, who would be willing to take care of a sickly princess? It was fine if she was not favored, but she was actually still alive after 4 years of illness. It was a miracle. Gong Yimo pretended to just wake up and glanced at her. Every time this palace maid was angry, she would come to the previous Gong Yimo to vent. Sometimes, she would not see her for a few days. She needed a quiet place to cultivate. Thinking of little Gong Dai who lived in the cold palace with her, she had an idea. It was better to get things done once and for all. She rolled her eyes. She took out a handkerchief from somewhere and coughed violently. The palace maid was afraid of her illness and distanced herself from her in disgust. However, she heard Gong Yimo's weak voice. "Ah, blood." The handkerchief she held up was stained with blood. This gave the palace maid a fright. Without waiting for her to say anything, Gong Yimo pitifully said intermittently, "It can't be tuberculosis, right? That was contagious." Immediately, the palace maid was so frightened that she hurriedly ran out. When she was far away, Gong Yimo relaxed and smiled. This way, it wouldn't be long before the cold palace she lived in would be quarantined. No one would come to seriously confirm whether or not an unfavored princess like her really had tuberculosis. Thus, leaving her to fend for herself was the best way to deal with it. In the future, other than delivering meals, there would not be any blind people who would come to find trouble with her. She could cultivate in peace. Otherwise, if someone discovered her abnormality, it would be really troublesome. Just as she thought, a few palace maids came in a hurry. When they saw her sickly appearance and the blood-stained handkerchief in her hand, they did not dare to come close. They quickly quarantined the place and set up several layers of locks. Only a small window was left open for the delivery of meals. They really left her to fend for herself? For a 7-year-old child, this was really cruel. Gong Yimo smiled. This was exactly what she wanted. When everyone left, she finally relaxed and jumped off the bed. After taking a deep breath in the courtyard, she stretched her arms and legs. The sunlight after the rain sprinkled down like gold, illuminating the small beads of sweat on her thin and weak little face. The set of external skills that she practiced was a set of internal skills. The external skills were somewhat similar to the Tai Chi that she knew before she transmigrated. The internal skills were also particular about being long and continuous, with a good foundation. Chapter 7. This was not a technique suitable for women to practice, but at that time, she had taken a liking to it at first glance. It was because of her master's smooth and natural rhythm when he practiced it. It also had a peaceful name, Wind and Nature. In her previous life, she practiced this technique, But no matter how hard she tried, she could not understand the profound meaning behind it. At that time, she was too impetuous. She only felt that with space in her hands, the world was vast, and she could go anywhere. But in the end, she ended up with a life of poverty and a tragic death in her prime. This was not the life she wanted at the beginning. She wanted to sing in the mountains, stop the boat to fish, do justice, and live a carefree life. In this life, she must practice martial arts hard and be a person who does as she pleases. In the future, she would beat up Gong Dai until his teeth fell out. Days passed. Gong Yimo raced against time to practice martial arts during the day and went to look for food at night. However, every time, she would subconsciously go around the place where little Gong Dai was. She had done everything she could in the past. It was already benevolent of her not to take revenge. She would not interfere anymore. In the blink of an eye, 2 months had passed. Recently, because she had been eating well and had made some progress in her internal energy, Gong Yimo's face finally had some flesh. It faded away from the yellow of her illness, revealing the white color that belonged to her age. She did not know if she had inherited it from Xue Fei, but her skin was very good. It was white and clear, like ice and jade bones. It was unforgettable. This was something that did not happen in her previous life. It turned out that the technique she practiced was obtained by a master who had broken through the rhythm of nature. If one could understand its profound meaning, every step up would have the effect of changing the meridians and cleansing the marrow. In her previous life, she was impetuous all her life and could not break through. She did not expect that in this life, she would gain something at such a young age. It could be considered a blessing in disguise. Gong Yimo patted her delicate face and thought to herself, "I'm so happy." The food delivered to her by Long Chuyuan was becoming more and more perfunctory. They probably thought that she was dead, and no one dared to come in to see her, so they just let it be. However, she did not expect that in these 2 days, someone would send food to the small window again. A few days ago, after she finished practicing, she peeled it open and found that it was still a white and tender bun. It was really unbelievable. Had the people of the cold palace suddenly become kind? That day, the person who delivered the food didn't come for a long time. Just when Gong Yimo thought that he wouldn't come and was about to find food herself, the small window suddenly opened. Gong Yimo was a little surprised. Who was so kind to deliver food 3 days in a row? She saw a thin and weak hand holding an oiled paper bag, carefully placing it on the window. He seemed to be reluctant to part with it, but he still put it down and left. Before he left, he gently closed the window. Gong Yimo was surprised. She ran over and opened it. She was shocked. She didn't expect it to be an intact drumstick. It was still warm, so it could be seen that it wasn't placed in a lunchbox, but in someone's arms. For a moment, Gong Yimo was quite moved. Seeing that he was a young child, perhaps he was a new eunuch in the palace. She wanted to see who he was, just for his kindness, so that she could repay him in the future. Thinking of this, she climbed over the wall and went out. Now, it was easy for her to climb over the wall. It was completely different from 2 months ago. As soon as she went out, she saw a small figure limping away. She quickly chased after him, but she didn't expect that he lived in the courtyard next to her, the Hanshun courtyard that had been deserted for many years. Gong Yimo squatted in the corner of the palace wall and looked down under the canopy of a big tree. The more she looked, the more familiar it seemed. She saw that after the boy entered the courtyard, he used a broken basin to clean himself. He was covered in filth and there were new bruises on his face, but he cleaned himself so seriously that it was obvious that he was a child who loved cleanliness. Gong Yimo took a closer look and was slightly shocked. It was him. Why was he living next to her? The news of her tuberculosis had spread like wildfire. Wasn't he afraid? After not seeing him for 2 months, little Gong Dai was even skinnier than before. He was just skin and bones, which made his black, jade-like eyes even bigger. At first glance, he looked very scary. She didn't know where he went to roll around, but his body was dirty. Compared to the self-disciplined child from before, he was a completely different person. His hands and feet seemed to be injured. His small hands took off his outer clothes with great effort, revealing his inner clothes with half of the sleeves and his shockingly thin but scarred arms. He took out a clean white robe and put it on. Gong Yimo knew at a glance that it was the bathrobe that he had cut off, so it could be worn as an outer robe. After changing his clothes, he took out a small paper bag and frowned like a little adult. Presumably, there was some food inside. Seeing this, Gong Yimo didn't feel good. It wasn't easy for a little boy to survive in this kind of cold palace. She didn't know if he was the one who gave her the food just now. Just as Gong Yimo wanted to go down and ask about it, a few people came from afar. Gong Yimo hid again and quietly watched. The people who came kicked open the courtyard door. Before little Gong Dai could react, the other party had already lifted him up. The head eunuch was not young and had a lot of strength. He held little Gong Dai so tightly that he couldn't breathe. His little arms and legs kicked in the air as he gritted his teeth. Impudent. His words made the four eunuchs laugh. One of them said in a shrill voice, "Listen, he still thinks he's a prince and says we're impudent." At this moment, another young eunuch picked up the oiled paper bag on the ground and laughed in a strange voice. At that time, I thought it was strange. No matter how we hit him, he was protecting his chest. When I went back to check, I found that a drumstick was missing. You must have stolen the buns from before. I didn't expect that a prince would also steal things. As he spoke, he tore open the paper bag and scattered some leftovers on the ground. The eunuchs looked at each other. How was that possible? They clearly saw him steal the drumstick. He must have eaten it. So they were still fierce and evil, even stepping on the oiled paper bag on the ground again and again. People say that dragons give birth to dragons and phoenixes give birth to phoenixes. This dragon cub actually did such a thing. What do you think we should do? The head eunuch who was choking Gong Dai said maliciously. Someone immediately agreed. He, either hand over the drumstick, or, is His Highness very hungry? Why don't you eat all the food on the ground? We won't pursue this matter. Little Gong Dai was thrown on the ground like a rag. He couldn't stop coughing. Looking at the eunuchs who were closing in on him, his eyes were filled with stubbornness and fear. He didn't understand. He had clearly been beaten up when he came, so why did they still come looking for him? At this moment, how could Gong Yimo not understand what happened? She didn't expect that he was the one who brought her food these days. Gong Yimo suddenly felt very uncomfortable. Chapter 8. She felt that she had done her best and decided not to interact with him anymore. But she didn't expect that he would repay her kindness at such a young age. He was obviously weak, but he still wanted to take care of her. At this moment, her sharp eyes saw the head eunuch signaling to another eunuch. That eunuch nodded, and with a flip of his hand, a silver needle appeared. Previously in the kitchen, they couldn't do anything under the watchful eyes of everyone. But now, all they needed to do was to give him a needle. This was a new drug that the higher-ups had spent a lot of effort to obtain. The poison victim died half a month later. No one could find out who was the instigator. Seeing the few people approaching with ill intentions, little Gong Dai tried his best not to show his fear, but his small body shrank back. He was only 6 years old, so when he shrank back, he was so small. But he had to face the persecution of so many adults alone. That eunuch saw his vigilant look and laughed. What are you afraid of? Eat. You must be very hungry, right? Or you can't eat anymore after eating a drumstick. The eunuch holding the silver needle in the dark said as he stepped forward with a fierce look, "Since that's the case, I'll help you spit it out." As he said that, he kicked the child's abdomen. This kick was extremely heavy. The child cried out weakly, and his whole body shrank into the shape of a shrimp. Cold sweat flowed down. This wasn't enough. The eunuch reached out to grab him. His fingertips were the silver needle. That kick just now had already made Gong Yimo burn with anger. She didn't expect these people to be so vicious. The stone in her hand shot out and hit the silver needle in his hand. The eunuch screamed and covered his hand. His face changed. Who is it? But the surroundings were quiet. No one answered. A gust of cold wind blew in the courtyard, making people shiver inexplicably. Thinking that next door was the sickly princess who was said to have no one to collect her corpse, the eunuchs' faces became very ugly. At this moment, the head eunuch gritted his teeth. "I want to see who is pretending to be a ghost." As he said that, he reached out to grab little Gong Dai again. At this moment, a stone was shot at his temple with a murderous aura. Because it happened so quickly, the onlookers only saw the fierce-looking eunuch inexplicably fall to the ground. When they went to push him up, they discovered that he had actually died with his eyes open. Ghost! Someone screamed and ran away. The remaining 2 people were also afraid, but they were even more afraid that they would not be able to explain themselves. They dragged the head eunuch's corpse and hurriedly left, leaving behind a child who was coughing. The dilapidated Hanshun courtyard immediately quieted down. Little Gong Dai was also very scared. He struggled to sit up. His face was covered in cold sweat due to the pain, but he had no time to wipe it off. His large eyes looked around vigilantly, and one of his hands gripped the sharp stone in his sleeve tightly. Seeing that there was no one around for a long time, his small body relaxed slightly. Whether the other party was a human or a ghost, they were helping him, so there was nothing to be afraid of. He touched his empty stomach and looked at the food on the ground. His eyes were full of struggle. He had not eaten for 2 days. Previously, he was seriously injured. The next day, he heard the palace servant say in a panic that someone had contracted tuberculosis. He listened carefully and found out that it was the royal sister. He was very surprised. At the same time, he felt very sad and guilty. His royal sister's body looked very weak. Was it because she came to see him and got drenched in the rain, which caused her illness to worsen? However, because the cold autumn courtyard where she lived had been locked, he did not know the truth. Because of his serious injuries, he was not able to visit her for 2 months. During this period of time, his life was very miserable. Because he couldn't move, those palace servants were even more unscrupulous. The amount of food they sent to him every day was pitifully small, which delayed his recovery for a full 2 months. Once he recovered, he went to find the head eunuch and requested to move to Hanshun Courtyard, which was next to Longqiu Courtyard. Although he was young, he knew that the eunuch would definitely agree. They wanted him to die. Now that he asked to move to the side of a tuberculosis patient, they had no reason to stop him. Sure enough, under the old eunuch's malicious sneer, little Gong Dai lived alone in the Hanshun Courtyard, which had not been lived in for more than 10 years. After he moved there, the palace servants did not send him food anymore. Everyone thought that Gong Yimo was dead, but the little boy thought that she was just sick and would recover. In order to target him, the palace servants refused to send him food because they were afraid. Little Gong Dai was anxious and had no choice but to steal food. In his opinion, when a person was sick, they should eat something good. When he was sick, his mother did this. Therefore, he took risks again and again. He was small and weak, so he did not dare to take too much. Today, when he saw the plate of chicken drumsticks, he swallowed hard. However, he was afraid that he would be discovered if he took too much, so he only took one. He did not expect that he would still be caught and beaten up. Fortunately, he had been protecting his chest, so the drumstick was fine. When he put down the oiled paper bag, he touched it again. It was still warm. It's just. Little Ju touched his belly. He was also very hungry. It was okay. He was an adult. He was not like royal sister who was sick. It was okay for him to miss 1 or 2 meals. He raised his little hand, and the piercing pain in his body made his little face contort. Looking at the ruined food on the ground, a trace of pity flashed in his eyes. However, his heart was filled with resentment. When he grew up, he would definitely teach those who bullied him a lesson. Gong Yimo had been watching from the side. She did not know if she should go out, but when she saw the little boy clenching his teeth and reaching out to pick up the oiled paper bag on the ground, she could not bear to watch and walked out. The little boy was caught in the act and was stunned. He quickly retracted his hand and his face turned red. His heart was filled with fear, hatred, and sorrow. He was a prince. He actually wanted to eat the food that had been stepped on by someone on the ground. When he saw who it was, he was pleasantly surprised. After not seeing her for 2 months, his royal sister's complexion had improved a lot. It seemed that she had recovered. Immediately, his face turned pale and a hurt expression flashed across his big eyes. If she had recovered, why didn't she come to see him all this time? As expected, she was afraid of being implicated by him. Gong Yimo knew at a glance that he was up to no good. She walked over and sat beside him. She rolled her eyes and slapped the back of his head. Seeing little Gong Dai covering his head with an aggrieved expression and complaining with a pair of big black eyes, Gong Yimo nodded in satisfaction. A child should act like a child. How could she endure the fact that his brain worked so quickly? At least you have a conscience. Previously, I was sick, but I was starving. If you had not sent me food these 2 days, I would not have recovered so quickly. She softened her tone and spoke with a pleasant expression for the first time. Her words affirmed little Gong Dai's actions during this period of time. He was still young after all. His eyes lit up when he heard this. Was it really because of him that royal sister recovered so quickly? Gong Yimo nodded affirmatively. She took out the oiled paper bag with the chicken drumstick and giggled. You gave this to me too, right? I haven't eaten meat in a long time. Let's eat together. Chapter 9. Little Gong Dai's large eyes stared straight at the paper bag that was giving off a meaty aroma. His little mouth was still trying to be brave. I have already eaten. Royal sister. Why would he pick up the food on the floor after eating? Did he think she was stupid? Gong Yimo decisively gave him a knock on the head. Seeing him hug his head and call her royal sister again, she felt very pleased. Children should be more honest. Did they hit you? Does it hurt? Little Gong Dai wanted to say that it didn't hurt, but when he saw the little girl staring at him sternly, he swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth and said sullenly, It hurts. How could it not hurt? It was just that he had been hit too many times and had become very good at enduring it. Gong Yimo's eyes flashed with a trace of pity. He was so young now, but he was tolerant and sensible. A child like this was really hard to hate. As she thought about it, she opened the oil paper bag quickly. When the oil paper was peeled off, the aroma became even clearer. Little Gong Dai couldn't help but sniff a few times. He was so thin that there was nothing cute about him at all, let alone his future glory. When those terrifyingly large eyes looked over, it was even a little scary. She didn't know what he had experienced in the past 2 months. He had lost so much weight, but he was still worried that she didn't have anything to eat. The more Gong Yimo looked at him, the more she couldn't bear it. She forced a smile and patted him on the shoulder. She showed her white teeth and said, Let's eat together. If you say no, I'll leave. The threat in her words made little Gong Dai swallow all his words. Gong Yimo was satisfied with his obedience and nodded. Fortunately, the drumstick was quite big. Gong Yimo tore off a piece. It was already cold, so she stuffed it into little Gong Dai's mouth. Eat. Little Gong Dai looked at her, not knowing whether to eat or vomit. Royal Sister's body had just recovered, and it was time for her to eat meat. Just as he was thinking, Gong Yimo tore off another piece and stuffed it into his mouth, interrupting his thoughts. Don't think too much when you're eating. Little Gong Dai nodded subconsciously. Seeing that half of the drumstick was gone, he mumbled, You eat too? Gong Yimo grinned. All right, I'll eat too. As she spoke, she tore off a small piece and put it in her mouth. This drumstick had too much salt and oil. It looked beautiful, but it was very greasy. If it was a normal day, she wouldn't even look at it. However, when she saw little Gong Dai squinting his eyes and puffing his cheeks in satisfaction, her heart ached. She fiercely bit the remaining meat into her mouth and said viciously, Let's go. I'll take you to a restaurant. It was a dark and windy night. Gong Yimo and Gong Dai's 2 small figures were lying on the roof, watching a row of palace maids carrying food boxes into a brightly lit room. The 2 little ones swallowed their saliva. It was said that a concubine Zhou lived here. She was a little old and wasn't favored now, but it was a time of peace and prosperity. The treatment in the harem was quite good. Just the food, a concubine's share of meat was 6 catties per day. How could a woman like her, who had to maintain her figure, eat that? At this time, the food boxes were placed one by one on the bronze and gilded square table, exuding a tempting fragrance. The mistress was looking at herself in the mirror, holding her face. She was fine at first, but suddenly dropped the bronze mirror. Seeing concubine Zhou angry, the people in the room knelt down. This mistress's temper wasn't good, so they didn't dare to touch her reverse scale. You're all a bunch of trash. I said that I wanted the rouge from Fragrant Pavilion, but what did you buy? Seeing that I'm not favored, you're all so perfunctory? A woman about 20 years old opened her scarlet lips in anger. But as she scolded, she finally threw herself on the dressing table and cried. After entering the palace for 5 years, she was already an old person that no one cared about. Not to mention the favored concubine Long and concubine Lu. Even concubine Li, who entered the palace last year, had a higher status than her. With 30,000 people in the harem, the emperor's favor was not enough. Gong Yimo, who was lying on the roof, sighed. She thought that concubine Zhou was already very beautiful, but she didn't expect that she was also a living widow. She didn't know what kind of fairy could obtain the favor of Emperor Yusheng. Emperor Yusheng. She whispered to Gong Dai, "Do you see? Emperor Yusheng has harmed so many women. Your and my concubine mother is one of them. You've grown up. You can't be like this." She knew that the future regent Gong Dai's harem couldn't be underestimated. Although he was infatuated with Su Miaolon, the women in the harem were all heavenly beauties and didn't waste time. Gong Yi looked at the little boy in front of her. At this time, he was lying on the roof, not daring to move because of the pain in his body. He was obviously very well-behaved and pitiful. Gong Yimo said seriously. Hearing Gong Yimo say this, the 6-year-old little Gong Dai blushed and muttered, "I won't be like this in the future." When his concubine mother was favored, he only served her for 2 or 3 days a month. He didn't want to have so many women like his imperial father. Thinking of his imperial father, little Gong Dai's eyes dimmed for a moment. Not only did his imperial father have many women, but his imperial father also had more than 20 princes. He probably didn't remember him anymore. Now, the people by his side all stayed far away from him and only thought of him as a scourge. Little Gong Dai secretly glanced at the unfathomable royal sister beside him and felt slightly disappointed. Now, his only hope was that the royal sister could stay and not let him be alone. Gong Yimo was still not satisfied with little Gong Dai's answer and said seriously, "A good man will only marry one woman in his life. Don't talk about concubines. He should have a pair for his whole life." Little Gong Dai widened his eyes in confusion. Idle farmers and merchants can also marry wives and take concubines. Why only marry one woman? Gong Yimo rolled her eyes. Look at her. Little Gong Dai obediently looked down. That concubine Zhou had thrown a tantrum and was crying. Her cries were gentle, but no one could stop her. In this kind of silent palace, it was quite desolate. Think about your imperial mother again. Little Gong Dai couldn't help but think of his imperial mother's long sighs when she was reading at night. In the evening, she would always faintly look outside the hall, but she would often be disappointed when she couldn't see the figure of the eunuch. Seeing him think seriously, his large black eyes became a bit more sorrowful. Gong Yimo sighed and stroked his head as she slowly spoke. For a moment of pleasure, how many women like your imperial mother will appear by your side in the future? If they're not happy, you won't be happy with them. Seeing the little boy deep in thought, Gong Yimo gave him another strong dose of medicine with an evil smile. Think about it. If imperial father only had your imperial mother, how happy would your imperial mother be, and you wouldn't have fallen to this state? Her soft words made little Gong Dai's eyes fill with coldness. He clenched his little fists and firmly said in a childish voice, "All right, I will only marry one person in the future. I don't want anyone else to be like imperial mother." Gong Yimo smiled and narrowed her eyes. The child can be taught. Chapter 10. She was very beautiful when she smiled. At this time, the moonlight shined down and illuminated Gong Yimo's white face and bright eyes. The night wind blew her long and slender hair, bringing with it the fragrance of flowers. This scene made the little Gong Dai on the roof speechless. He would only marry one person in the future, but he was also glad that his father had other women. It was because he had other people that he could have such a royal sister, such a beautiful royal sister. At this time, a sharp voice was heard. It turned out that this concubine Zhou also needed to dress up while eating. A frightened palace maid came forward. Because she was too scared, she accidentally hurt her and was pushed to the ground by her. Her eyes were full of twisted anger. "Impudent! Even you don't put me in your eyes? Nyang Nyang, please forgive me. Nyang Nyang." This servant didn't do it on purpose. A little girl wearing palace clothes repeatedly kowtowed. Soon, blood appeared on her forehead. Seeing her make a mistake, some palace maids couldn't bear to look away. No one dared to plead for her. In the inner palace, pity was the most unnecessary thing. The sound of kowtowing continued. In this kind of lonely and cold inner palace, killing people seemed to be a joyful thing. That concubine Zhou looked down at the terrified palace maid at her feet. Her beautiful eyes flashed with an inexplicable cold light as she suddenly sneered. "What are you standing there for? This girl can't even hold a comb properly. What use is her hands? Drag her out and chop off her hands." The little palace maid's face turned white and she couldn't stop trembling. "I beg Nyang Nyang to spare my life. Nyang Nyang, spare my life." "Spare your life?" Seeing the little palace maid being dragged away with an ashen face, concubine Zhou's mood became much better. This inner palace is a place where people are eaten. You can only blame your life for being cheap. You can't be a person above others. Seeing this scene, Gong Yimo had a flash of inspiration. She just happened to want to find someone to take care of Gong Dai. This timid palace maid was perfect. Thinking of this, she wanted to turn around and get down, but she was pulled back by Gong Dai. "Royal sister, what are you doing?" He looked at her with a strange expression. Gong Yimo pulled her hand back and said anxiously, "Of course it's to save her." Little Gong Dai looked surprised for a moment. He thought that Gong Yimo was soft-hearted, so he spoke hesitantly with a strange expression. "Royal sister, when the masters in the palace make a mistake, the servants have the right to kill. Punishing the servants is the right of a superior. You can't do anything about it." These words were said by his imperial father. He remembered it very clearly. Everyone respected and feared his imperial father. When he said these words, no one dared to raise their heads because he was the superior of everyone. Gong Yimo was in a hurry to save the person, but when she heard these words, she stopped and looked at little Gong Dai with a complicated expression. She wasn't a saint, but she suddenly wondered if all the people in the inner palace were like this. They could cold-bloodedly accept these rules at such a young age. Under the moonlight, her little face was tense. This kind of seriousness made little Gong Dai's heart palpitate, and he didn't dare to speak again. A moment later, Gong Yimo pointed in the direction where the palace maid was being dragged away, her voice calm and slow. "So you and I are also superior." Gong Ju couldn't see her expression as the wind lifted her robe, but he could clearly hear her voice, one word at a time. "Let me tell you, the greatest power in the hands of a true superior is not to punish, but to forgive. Only when you have the power to not fear any consequences can you forgive others. This is a superior." After saying this, she turned and left, completely ignoring little Gong Dai who was left on the roof. His heart was in a perilous situation. When he was young, he had received the most orthodox education for a prince. He had seen many superiors punish servants. There were so many punishments that people couldn't count them all. After seeing many of them, he only felt that it was right and didn't have a trace of pity. For example, if the person who saved him a few days ago wasn't royal sister, but any palace maid, he would be grateful but not grateful, because it was natural for a palace maid to save her master. But at this time, hearing a few screams from not far away, the little one opened his shockingly bright black jade eyes and muttered to himself, "Not punishment, but forgiveness? Forgive those people?" After saving the palace maid, she didn't feel grateful, but knelt on the ground and cried in fear. She escaped this time, but if the Empress found out, what awaited her next time wouldn't be a punishment like having her hand cut off. Gong Yimo was annoyed by her crying, so she grabbed her hand and shook it. "Don't cry. Let me ask you, do you want to live?" The little girl looked at Gong Yimo, who was even smaller than her and only reached her waist, and cried even more fiercely, "I want to live. The Empress won't let me off." Gong Yimo was annoyed by her crying, so she reached out her hand again to shut her up. She said gloomily, "If you want to live, then don't cry." This is the courtyard of the female official in charge of the imperial harem. Go in and beg her. Explain the whole story, and then ask to be transferred to the Cold Palace to take care of the princess who was banished to the Cold Palace a few years ago. If the princess is already dead, say that you are willing to collect her corpse, she will agree. Outsiders only thought that she had tuberculosis. Now, because of Gong Dai, there were people who used excuses not to send her food. In the long run, if people knew that the princess had starved to death, they wouldn't be able to escape responsibility. Now that the princess was probably already dead, if someone was willing to be a scapegoat, they wouldn't have to worry about not agreeing. The little palace maid blinked her teary eyes and said in a small voice, "Is it really possible?" As long as she went to the cold palace, she could escape having her hand chopped off. Would concubine Zhou let her go? Gong Yimo nodded affirmatively. Go. Now that a dead horse was a living horse, the little palace maid didn't dare to delay and stumbled over to ask for an audience. Looking at her back, Gong Yimo sighed slightly. An unfavored concubine didn't dare to offend a female official with real power. Also, she knew that this little palace maid was going to be a scapegoat. Concubine Zhou would probably be too happy. As for herself, although she had saved someone, her mood was very melancholic. As expected, Gong Yimo, who was lying on the roof, saw the surprise on the steward's aunt's face when she heard this and knew that it was a success. She flew to find Gong Dai. Now, she had some skills, but she only dared to move around in the periphery. The inner courtyard of the imperial palace was full of experts. She didn't dare to wander around. Returning to concubine Zhou's courtyard, she stole some stored grain and found Gong Dai. Seeing her come back, little Gong Dai let out a big sigh of relief. Although Royal Sister was very strong, he was still worried that something would happen to her and she wouldn't return. After experiencing so many betrayals, he only had Royal Sister as his family. His nose twitched and saw that Gong Yimo had brought over a whole roasted chicken. Gong Dai felt that his eyes weren't listening to him, but he really had been hungry for a long time. Gong Yimo smiled and sat beside him. She very heroically tore off a leg for him. Eat. Little Gong Dai's eyes lit up when he heard this. He quickly took it, but he was of good birth. Even though he was very hungry, he still ate in small bites. His pair of beautiful eyes narrowed in satisfaction. He was so well-behaved, obedient, and sensible. It was really hard to associate him with the psychopath in the future who killed people without blinking. Seeing that he was so thin, she didn't know how distressed his Mufei would be if she knew. Chapter 11. As she thought about it, she fed the little boy. Gong Yimo hadn't eaten much when she suddenly spoke. Eat more. You're too skinny. Then she thought of something and said, I saved the palace maid just now. You're too young. She'll take care of you in the future. Gong Yimo originally thought that the little boy would be happy to hear this, but who knew that he would suddenly look up at Gong Yimo, his beautiful eyes full of hurt. He put down the half-eaten drumstick and clenched his fists tightly. After a while, he spoke carefully. I'm all grown up. I don't need anyone to take care of me. He had survived these 2 months. Although it was tough, it was nothing. Gong Yimo frowned. How can that be? You have to listen to me. Was it possible that a child like him would have to wash his own clothes and steal food in the future? Her words made little Gong Dai even sadder. His eyes widened, and he was about to cry. He subconsciously tugged at his clothes. Royal Sister, I'm very obedient. I eat very little. I'm all grown up. I won't trouble anyone. After saying that, he suddenly grabbed Gong Yimo's sleeve. He opened his beautiful eyes and begged softly like a little animal. Royal Sister, I'll do anything and I'll definitely listen to you. I won't be a burden to you in the future. Don't abandon me. His words shocked Gong Yimo. Children's senses were indeed sharp. She had already decided not to interfere, but she didn't expect little Gong Dai to notice it so quickly. She looked at his shockingly skinny hand grabbing her sleeve. This hand had even brought her food during the day. She couldn't bear to be ruthless. There wasn't a single piece of flesh on his body that was unharmed. He had to constantly be on guard against others. Every step in the cold palace was dangerous. Although he wouldn't die even if she didn't interfere, was she going to let a child live such a hard life every day? Gong Dai left the cold palace at the age of 13. She didn't know how much blood and tears he had shed in that short sentence, but seeing this skinny child begging her timidly, it felt so real. It was probably the little boy's first time begging someone. His entire body was tense, afraid that she would reject him. He looked at her without blinking. For the first time, he wished that someone could stay by his side, even if she didn't do anything. He was all grown up and could go find his own food. The days in the cold palace were so long and cold. He just wanted someone to accompany him and let him see her. Gong Yimo's small face showed a touch of extreme helplessness. Oh God, why did she have to be so kind and beautiful? She couldn't understand. She suddenly raised her hand and gave him a knock on the head. She said exasperatedly, "Hurry up and eat. If you eat so little, when will you gain weight?" Little Gong Dai ignored his headache. He keenly sensed that Gong Yimo's attitude had warmed up. He quickly pulled Gong Yimo's hand and carefully confirmed, "Royal sister won't abandon me, right?" Gong Yimo rolled her eyes. Yes, yes. I'm still waiting to raise you and live a good life with you." That was what she said, but the more Gong Yimo thought about it, the more she felt that it was feasible. If she could put down her hatred and get along well with Gong Dai, their relationship growing up together might not be inferior to the love between a man and a woman with Su Miaolan in the future. Gong Dai would be the most powerful person in the Daiyu state in the future. He had a large number of troops in his hands. Even Gong Che, who had been the regent for 5 to 6 years and later ascended the throne with her help, couldn't do anything to him. He could be said to be second only to one person. If she hugged this thigh tightly, wouldn't she be able to do whatever she wanted in the future? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that it was a good idea. Anyway, she was still young and had nowhere to go. She might as well stay in the cold palace and build a good relationship with the future regent. Little Gong Dai was originally overjoyed when he heard Gong Yimo's words. However, Gong Yimo's gaze made his scalp tingle. His royal sister seemed to be calculating something. She looked like she was waiting for a good offer. However, he was very happy that he was valued by her. He was really well behaved. Those eyes revealed a hint of intelligence. If he was raised well, he might become a good and upright regent in the future, and not a demon who could cure children who cried at night. Gong Yimo patted his head. She thought that since she had already decided to raise him, if he still sided with Su Miaolan in the future, she would break his legs the way she raised him. Gong Yimo's eyes revealed a fierce glint, but she still looked at Gong Dai with a smile. The more she looked, the more satisfied she was. The poor little Gong Dai shrunk his neck. The royal sister's expression was so scary. In the future, he would definitely listen to everything the royal sister said. He definitely wouldn't dare to disobey her. After discussing the important matters of life, the two little ones continued to eat meat. Because they were relaxed, their appetites were quite good. They finished the 3 to 4 caddies of roasted chicken. Gong Yimo sighed. It would be great if there was a bottle of Coke at this time. After eating, the two sat on the roof and looked at the stars, completely ignoring the fact that they were in someone else's territory. The imperial palace at night was still very beautiful. The closer they were to the center, the brighter the palace lanterns. Under the moonlight, the eaves flew up, and the layers of roof tiles stacked on top of each other. The magnificent buildings made the two of them unable to see the end. Gong Dai never felt that the place he had lived in for 6 years was so magnificent. After looking at it for a while, he only felt that his heart was exceptionally peaceful. Beside the royal sister, it was like being beside his imperial mother. His entire body felt relaxed and free. Little Gong Dai turned his head to look at Gong Yimo. He saw that she was slightly leaning forward, as if she was very curious as she looked left and right. Her skin was like the moonlight, and her eyes were as bright as stars. When imperial concubine Shui passed away, he was still young, but he had heard of her great reputation. A woman who could be doted on so much by imperial father, her daughter should be so beautiful. However, after she died, the people in the harem never mentioned her name again. So, even now, he still didn't know what this royal sister's name was. Royal sister. Gong Yimo turned her head back, asking with her eyes. Her expression was always so vivid. Gong Dai felt that the moment she looked back, her expression had changed several times. He didn't know what the slight heat in his heart was, but he felt that it was difficult to raise his head under the other's beautiful eyes. So, he lowered his head and whispered, "Royal sister, my name is Ju, and I don't have a character." "Royal sister, what's your name?" Gong Yimo was stunned. When she had first named herself, the entire harem was in an uproar. How could there be someone who didn't know her name? But then she remembered that when she entered the cold palace, Gong Dai was only 2 years old. After imperial concubine Shui died, no one would mention her name in front of him. It was normal that he didn't know. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but sigh. Back then, her name was the strong declaration of love by the Supreme Emperor. It was a thorn in the hearts of the 30,000 women in the harem. But now, it was more like a joke. When a person died, it was as if a lamp had been extinguished. Even this name seemed to be stained with dust, unable to find its original glory. Gong Yimo. Little Gong Dai raised his head, only to see the little girl's face slightly tilted up, looking at the brightest light in the palace. Her expression was solemn as she repeated her name again. "My name is Gong Yimo." Chapter 12. He didn't know why, but the firmness in her voice made little Gong Dai feel a bit of longing. Gong Yimo, helping each other in times of need, was originally used to describe two fishes that were about to die, mouth to mouth, and helping each other in order to survive. But when it was used on a person, even if they were about to die, they would still need to rely on each other. How moving was that? He cupped his cheek and looked at Gong Yimo's side profile, secretly thinking, just like how he and the royal sister were now. Were they also helping each other in times of need? Gong Yimo. What a good name. He never thought that this name would leave a deep imprint on his body like this moonlit night, a memory that he would never forget for the rest of his life. Shui Fei's death caused this name to be covered in dust, but in little Gong Dai's eyes, this name had a different meaning, giving it a new luster. After finishing her martial arts practice early in the morning, Gong Yimo sat in the courtyard with a bitter face, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Just now, she had a sudden impulse to tidy up the things in her space. This space was originally very useless. Not only did it not have a spirit spring, but it also couldn't store living things, which made her the most annoyed. Unfortunately, in her previous life, she had transmigrated at a very unlucky time, so there weren't many useful things in her space. Before transmigrating, she loved to travel, so her space was mostly filled with wilderness supplies and daily necessities. The space wasn't very big, only about 20 to 30 cubic meters. However, before transmigrating, she had been asked by a friend to move. Unfortunately, her friend was a bookworm, and her house was filled with books. Originally, she was only going to help, but her friend had something to do at the last minute and left, leaving her to move by herself. She had called a car to move, but after loading some home appliances and clothes, there wasn't enough space. In order to be lazy, Gong Yimo had packed all the books into her space, filling it to the brim. However, she didn't expect that the moving truck had an accident on the road, so she had transmigrated. Therefore, besides some wilderness supplies and medicine, her space was filled with books. It was all books. In her previous life, when she was studying martial arts at Yunding Mountain, she read a lot of books in her free time. Later, when she went down the mountain, for Gong Che, she secretly helped him transport weapons, so she moved all the books out of her space. Later, when the prince's residence burned down, the books were burned. She regretted it for a while, and didn't expect that after transmigrating, these books would come back. Gong Yimo's mouth. If she had known that she would transmigrate, she would have gotten a few guns. However, these books were very useful. Her interest, of course, because of these books, she was able to help Gong Che in her previous life. However, it was because she brought too many advanced technologies into this space and time that caused many tragedies. SSSSSS. Gong Yimo S Tug. T of testes to know what to teach tus T. T S toot. Forget it. Let's start with learning how to read. At this time, there was a knock on the door. Gong Yimo waved her hand, and the things scattered in the courtyard disappeared. Gong Yimo directly jumped over the palace wall and landed in front of the person, scaring the palace maid in front of her. This palace maid was the one she saved. After she came, Gong Yimo directly asked her to take care of little Gong Dai and to knock on the door if there was anything. This palace maid was timid and didn't dare to disobey, so she stayed by Gong Dai's side. Her name was Xian. Xian was only 15 years old, and she was naturally timid. Previously, when she saw the legendary sickly princess, the little girl who saved her, she was shocked. But after getting along with her for a period of time, seeing this princess coming and going, she was used to it. Princes and princesses were different, and even if she said it out, no one would believe her. She might as well stay here. Seeing that the princess was so capable and listening to the princess's words, there might be a day when she would be successful in the future. Princess. She spoke pitifully, her fingers unconsciously twisting the plain-colored palace dress on her body, looking like a pushover. With teary eyes, she said, "This servant went to get food, but they chased me back." She lowered her head more and more. The more she spoke, the more useless she felt. She couldn't even do such a small thing. But the other party didn't want to give it to her, so she really had no choice. Gong Yimo didn't think much of it when she heard it. Those people in the cold palace were like this. They took pleasure in bullying those who used to be superior. Disobedient, right? She liked disobedient people the most. The little girl grinned, scaring Xian so much that she didn't dare to raise her head. "I'm hungry. Since they keep refusing to give me food, then let's go. Talk some sense into them." "Royal sister, where are you going?" After a few days of recuperation, little Gong Dai's complexion looked much better. At this time, he was wearing clothes that fit him well. Although he was still very thin, his innate temperament was still there. Moreover, he had shed the vigilance and maturity from before, and now he had the innocence of a child. Gong Yimo nodded, thinking that when he was fattened up in the future, he would still be a tender bun. "It's fine. I'll bring Xian to meet some people. We'll be back soon." He knew that royal sister was going to find trouble with those people in the cold palace for him. As a prince, how could he trouble his sister? Therefore, he blinked and said with a serious expression, "I want to go too." Gong Yimo shook her head. Gong Dai was in the cold palace, but there were still people trying to assassinate him every few days. It was clear that there were people above who were afraid of his identity as a prince. Since that was the case, she would be the only one in the limelight. In any case, she had decided to raise him. When he was still young, she would spare no effort to protect him. Thinking about it, she was really fearless. She was almost moved by her own motherly glory. In a short period of time, Gong Yimo already had authority in Gong Dai's heart. If his sister said that he couldn't go, then there was definitely no room for objection. Therefore, even if he was unwilling, Gong Dai still went back to practice the calligraphy that his sister had taught him a few days ago. A sense of powerlessness made little Gong Dai break the branch when he used it to write. Royal sister was clearly not much older than him, but she protected him in everything. When could he grow up to be someone like Imperial Father? When that time came, he would definitely not allow anyone to harm a single hair on royal sister's head. When Gong Yimo arrived at the residence of the palace servants in the cold palace, they had already eaten. This made Gong Yimo very angry. She kicked open the courtyard door. 7 or 8 palace servants stared at Gong Yimo in a daze, their gazes rather unfriendly. "Oh, isn't this your highness the princess? Look at you. You've actually recovered. You're truly a blessed person." The one who said this was the nanny in charge of the cold palace. Her surname was Su. She was now old and no longer had the opportunity to climb up the social ladder. Therefore, her gaze was very gloomy, and she also seemed to be smiling when she spoke. Gong Yimo also didn't like to beat around the bush. She grinned like a cute girl, as if she wasn't the one who had kicked open the door just now. "Nanny Su, this is your fault. This princess hasn't eaten yet, but you've already finished eating. You should know that Imperial Father banished me to the cold palace, but he didn't remove my princess status. Your actions are very disrespectful." Chapter 13. The palace servants on the side all showed disdain when they heard this. Banishing to the cold palace was equivalent to being imprisoned for life. They would never be able to see the emperor again. Even if they were disrespectful and harsh to their master, who would know? Su Mama sneered. She stared at Gong Yimo's small figure with a biting cold light in her eyes. "Princess, you're so arrogant. It's a pity that Su Mama isn't scared. You broke the courtyard door just now. How do you think you should pay for this? If it was really a child, seeing Gong Yimo's ferocious appearance, it should have been scared away. But who was Gong Yimo? She stood there with a smile, not afraid of the daggers in the other party's eyes at all. Su Mama, are you really not afraid that I, Gong Yimo, will be able to make a comeback one day? The small child's voice was obviously immature, but her manner was steady and magnanimous. She already had the demeanor of a princess. Before Su Mama could speak, Gong Yimo smiled again. My Dayu State's dynasty is famous for its military prowess. It has countless vassal states. Imperial Father didn't abolish my status as a princess. Perhaps in the future, when a foreign country asks for my hand in marriage, Imperial Father will show his magnanimity and allow me to marry into a country? As she spoke, her smile became even sweeter. When that time comes, if Imperial Father finds out that I'm being disciplined in the cold palace, but even my food is being treated harshly, I don't know if he will stand up for me. Her words caused the expressions of the palace servants present to change. The main reason was that there was only one princess who had been banished to the cold palace. They unconsciously treated her the same way they treated the imperial concubines and princes. They didn't think that she would have a chance to make a comeback in the future. After all, if she really wanted to marry into the imperial harem, many concubines would be unwilling. After thinking about it, only this princess was the most suitable. Su Mama's expression changed several times. She cursed under her breath before revealing a fawning smile on her face. Princess, what are you saying? How could we, as servants, have the guts to do that? It's just that princess's condition was so terrible that no one dared to approach. Now that princess has recovered, Su Mama will naturally have them serve you well and won't let them slack off. After speaking, the two of them looked at each other and reached a silent agreement. Gong Yimo looked at her and blinked, then smiled sweetly. If that's the case, then I've wronged Su Mama. Su Mama, please hurry. This princess is hungry. After saying that, she left with Exion'er, whose legs had already turned to jelly. Nanny Su gloomily looked at her back, her heart full of anger and unwillingness. Lai Fu, tube. Not long after Gong Yimo returned, a palace servant delivered 3 dishes and a soup. Although it was cold, it was much better than the leftovers from before. She climbed over the wall and brought Gong Dai over to let Exion tell him what happened. Gong Dai used his chopsticks to poke at the rice in front of him. His expression was cold as he snorted. What's the point of reasoning with this kind of palace servant? We should directly let them know our power. If they don't accept it, we'll beat them until they accept it. Gong Yimo, who was drinking soup, almost spat it out. So this child had formed such a concept at such a young age. She hit him on the head with her chopsticks, her eyes wide open. What's the use of showing off in a moment of anger? Right now, we're small and weak, so we have to keep a low profile, understand? Keep a low profile. She shouted for him to keep a low profile. Her eyes turned and she lowered her voice sneakily. It's not good to expose our trump card too early. What we have to do is to not make a move and sit still. Once we make a move, we have to cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. Do you understand? Gong Dai covered his head with a look of worship. I understand. Royal sister was still the best. But of course, there was no point in arguing with those people. When he grew up, he would definitely cut the weeds and eliminate the roots of those behind the scenes. The more he thought about it, the weaker he felt. Gong Dai said firmly, Royal sister, I want to learn martial arts. This made Gong Yimo a little hesitant. Back then, it was because Gong Dai's martial arts were far superior to hers that she ended up like that. Gong Yimo was a little afraid in her heart. After all, Gong Dai was a good seedling who was born to practice martial arts. She always felt a little uneasy in her heart. However, little Gong Dai did not know that. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was feasible. He directly tugged at Gong Yimo's sleeve and said softly, Royal sister, just agree. I'm not afraid of hardship. When I start practicing martial arts, I won't let anyone touch you at all. The determination in his eyes moved Gong Yimo slightly. She patted his head. The child in front of her clearly regarded her as the only person he trusted. If this kind of feeling would change in the future, she, Gong Yimo, would accept it. Okay, I'll teach you, Gong Dai said excitedly. Seeing that he finally had the romantic appearance of a 6-year-old child, Gong Yimo smiled slightly. Her similarly young face was filled with unquestionable confidence. Not only will I make you a martial arts expert, I will also let you know the heavens above and the earth below, and hold the supreme imperial power. Her slow words not only stunned Xiner, even Gong Dai's little face became serious. Gong Yimo looked at the child in front of her with her chin in her hand. Her voice was soft and slow. Royal sister will give you whatever you want. Now, I only have one question for you. Although her tone was so gentle, Gong Dai could hear the unprecedented seriousness in her voice. Will you betray me in the future? Gong Yimo winked playfully. She felt that it was a little childish for her to ask a 6-year-old child for a promise. Unexpectedly, Gong Dai's expression became serious. He looked seriously at Gong Yimo, his eyes flashing with a strange light. After a moment, he said slowly and firmly, Gong family's ancestors above, the 3rd generation of the 9th emperor, Zhang Xian, hereby swears, in this life, I will never do anything to harm Gong Yimo. If I violate this promise, may the heavens punish me and the earth destroy me. My soul will not enter the bloodline after death, and I will be abandoned by both man and God. The childish voice echoed in the empty cold autumn garden. After floating into the sky turned from cloudy to sunny. Rays of golden light sprinkled down and fell on Gong Dai's body through the window. It seemed to form layers of light binding him, causing his entire body to glow. Gong Yimo's eyes widened in shock. She did not expect the young Gong Dai to say such words. The shock in her heart could not be described. She excitedly patted him on the shoulder and said heroically, Okay, in the future, if I, Gong Yimo, have a share, then you, Gong Dai, have a share. In the future, we will be siblings. We will enjoy blessings and endure hardships together. Seeing the blush on royal sister's face, little Gong Dai was also very happy. In this empty cold courtyard, the two little people were like adults, making promises to each other and looking forward to the future. This scene became an extremely deep memory, imprinted in Xiner's mind. She suddenly felt that following these two masters was not too bad. 3 years passed in a flash. Now, Gong Yimo was 10 years old, and Gong Dai was 9. Chapter 14. The 9-year-old Gong Dai had already grown into an adorable little Shota. These few years, they had been eating and drinking well. Gong Yimo would often go out to bring back some spoils of war for a sumptuous meal. Their days were extremely comfortable. Finally, under Gong Yimo's relentless feeding, little Gong Dai had already grown into an adorable, delicate, and peerlessly delicate child. His initial frailness was no longer there, and that pair of beautiful and cold eyes added a lot of color to this little face. Gong Yimo loved to pinch the tender flesh on the other person's face to sigh at her own difficulties. Gong Dai, this little fellow, did not eat much meat for a long time. She had to force-feed him to get some baby fat, and the process was very difficult. She did not know what went wrong in these 3 years, but little Gong Dai had turned into a cold and mature face. Of course, in front of Gong Yimo, he was still a real little demon, but Gong Yimo, little Gong Dai, entered Lanchuan with a cold face. Looking at a certain someone who had not woken up in the middle of the day, his originally stern face became helpless, and finally he sighed faintly. Why was his royal sister so sleepy? It was as if she could not wake up from her sleep. She had completely overturned the capable and experienced image he had of her in his heart. Royal sister, he called out, but the girl in the bed only turned over, revealing her sleepy little face. The whole bed's quilt was twisted into a circular shape by her, and she hugged it tightly, as if she did not hear him. However, Gong Dai knew that royal sister's martial arts had improved recently, and her eyes and ears were better than before. How could she not eat breakfast every day? Gong Dai put aside the plate in his hand, and reached out to pull Gong Yimo's quilt, who knew that she would hug it tightly. She opened a pair of sleepy eyes and muttered pitifully, It's not noon yet. Let me sleep for a while more. On her snow-white little face, a little bit of red lips pouted just like that. Looking at it, Gong Dai had an inexplicable impulse to bite off that little bit of red lips. He shook his head cruelly, shaking away those thoughts. You said yesterday that you would teach me 2 new subjects today, biology and geography. You can't go back on your word. Speaking of this, Gong Yimo only wanted to let out a long sigh. Gong Dai's IQ was off the charts. Gong Yimo felt that the stock of knowledge in her brain would soon be used up. She would be able to learn many things after being taught once, and she would even be able to draw inferences about other things. She squinted her eyes and sized him up. Gong Dai seemed to have just taken a bath. That's right. He woke up early every day and practiced for 4 hours without stopping. If this continued, he would surpass her in a few years. The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she felt. Comparisons were odious. She was reborn, but she couldn't even catch up with a native. But what did it matter? Gong Yimo thought proudly that such an outstanding child would listen to everything she said. Then what was the point of her being so diligent? She had someone to rely on, so there was no need to panic. So she took advantage of Gong Dai's stupor to pull out the quilt. She pretended not to hear and continued to sleep. Gong Dai looked at his empty hands and sighed helplessly again. His cold eyes flashed with a trace of amusement. In that case, don't blame me for being ruthless. Gong Dai finished speaking very domineeringly. He kicked off his shoes and got under the quilt. Gong Yimo's scent hit him in the face, causing him to squint slightly. However, his hand was already very disobediently placed on Gong Yimo's waist. Gong Yimo curled into a ball as if she had been electrocuted. She laughed and scolded at the same time. Gong Xiaoju, how dare you? You dare to tickle me, you're dead. Gong Yimo was extremely ticklish. Her feet, armpits, neck, waist, thighs, and even her knees were all fatal places. However, Gong Dai was not afraid of being ticklish, or rather, he was very tolerant. So every time, Gong Yimo ended up begging for mercy. But this time was different. The day before yesterday, her internal strength had just broken through to the 3rd layer of wind in nature. Suppressing Gong Dai, who was only at the 2nd layer, could be said to be a piece of cake. In a short while, she used her absolute internal strength to suppress Gong Dai. Her whole body straddled him, and she laughed very proudly. Ha ha ha, Gong Xiaoju, you also have a day like this. Gong Dai's hands were pressed down by Gong Yimo, and he couldn't move. His jade face flushed red. Too slow. He had to work harder. He didn't want to be overwhelmed by Royal Sister. Gong Yimo's hands quickly tied Gong Ju's hands above his head. She laughed in a way that made Gong Ju want to hit her. She squinted her eyes, and her face was still flushed from the exercise. Her skin was tender and looked very charming. Gong Ju was fascinated by her appearance. It wasn't until he felt the pain on his face that he realized she was pinching his face again. Damn it, sooner or later, he will practice to get rid of this baby fat. Royal Sister. His tone was very helpless. It's almost noon. You should eat breakfast first. As he spoke, he gestured with his eyes to the plate he brought. However, Gong Yimo had just woken up, and her stomach was not hungry. Instead, she took out a feather from somewhere and smiled. Don't change the subject. Today, I must see if you are really not afraid of being ticklish. She quickly slid the feather over Gong Dai's neck. Although it was a little itchy, Gong Dai could completely endure it. He was even more helpless. Royal Sister, don't be like this. Seeing that his neck was not working, Gong Yimo frowned and grabbed his foot again. A beautiful foot that was like white jade, and it really did not look like a man's foot. Actually, if Gong Dai wanted to resist, it was not that he could not break free. However, Gong Yimo was annoyed by his tickling, and now that she wanted to take revenge, he let her be. He was still thinking about whether he should struggle a little to satisfy her bad taste. Seeing that his foot was not even afraid of being tickled, Gong Yimo was discouraged. She pouted and poked his chest. People who are not afraid of being ticklish don't love their wives. You will definitely be a scumbag in the future. This accusation was too unreasonable. Gong Dai could not refute it. He frowned slightly, but then he saw Gong Yimo's face turn into a naughty smile. Then try here. As she spoke, Gong Yimo actually tore open his clothes. Gong Dai felt a chill on his chest. and his face immediately became serious. Royal sister, stop fooling around. Fooling around? Gong Yimo was not afraid of things getting out of hand. She looked at Gong Dai's small body and clicked her tongue. Not bad. Your muscles are quite beautiful at such a young age. However, there were some scars from old injuries on his body, and it was obvious how he had been treated in the past. Under her naked gaze, Gong Dai's face turned red again. However, he caught a glimpse of pity in Gong Yimo's eyes. He knew that the scars on his chest had hurt her eyes. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly coaxed her gently. It's all in the past. It doesn't hurt anymore. Seeing him act like a little adult, Gong Yimo couldn't help but chuckle. Oh, what a sensible little thing. Let elder sister love him. Her eyes darted around, and she reached her hand under his clothes and deliberately tickled his waist. The skin contact made Gong Dai shrink back as if he had been electrocuted. Seeing that he was ticklish, Gong Yimo became even more unscrupulous. A dangerous look flashed across Gong Dai's eyes. He struggled free from the belt around his wrist, and when Gong Yimo was caught off guard, he flipped over and pressed himself on top of her. However, when he saw that Gong Yimo was not afraid at all and was even giggling, Gong Dai's eyes were filled with deep helplessness and indulgence. He reached out to stroke her hair and sighed. Royal sister, you are really disobedient. Chapter 15. At this moment, his clothes were open and his ink-black hair was scattered over his shoulders. His collarbone was white and exquisite. His cold appearance was very attractive. What a little evildoer. He was only young now. When he grew up, who knew how he would harm others? Gong Yimo giggled. If you dare to tickle me, I'll tear down your Hanshun court so that you have nowhere to go. Feeling the heat from her body between his legs, Gong Dai narrowed his eyes and smiled. If that's the case, I can only squeeze in the same bed as Jiejia. Royal sister, you have to take me in. Who knew that Gong Yimo was not afraid at all? Come, I'm just holding the quilt and don't feel it. Her straightforwardness made Gong Dai unable to continue. Although he was intelligent, he was still young and could not be as thick-skinned as Gong Yimo. After fooling around for a while, when Gong Yimo woke up, it was already noon. Gong Dai was very helpless about this, but he could not do anything to her. Seeing that she was washing her face, she carelessly splashed the water on her face. Sparkling and translucent water droplets slid down her fair and tender face. Her skin was truly as smooth as cream. The little lass was gradually growing up and her future appearance could already be seen. Before Gong Dai could regain his senses, Gong Yimo saw that the apples in the courtyard were ripe. Before eating, she went up to pick the fruit. Her laughter and Xian Er's soft persuasion were the most lively scenes in the cold palace. Gong Dai, who was practicing calligraphy in the courtyard, shook his head, as if he wanted to finish writing before eating without being disturbed. However, the corners of his mouth could not help but curl up. Sometimes he would think, if he had not met Gong Yimo, he might have survived in the cold palace. However, what kind of cold-blooded and heartless person would he have become? Before meeting her, Gong Dai felt that everyone in the world owed him. When he gained power in the future, he would definitely make those people pay with their blood. However, that kind of ruthless mood seemed to have been hidden after meeting her. He would become whatever she liked him to be. If she didn't like the side of him that was filled with hostility, then he would give it up. It was that simple. Gong Dai's heart was calm as he wrote down the last word. Unfortunately, the peaceful days did not last long. Gong Dai did not know that danger was gradually approaching because of the arrival of his loved ones. He was destined to walk a path filled with blood and slaughter. However, if he had Gong Yimo with him on this path, he would treat everything as scenery. Your Highness, the Prime Minister has sent a message saying that Zhenshi of Gojoseon has sent his son, Li Changfeng, to congratulate the Empress Dowager on her birthday. They are already on their way. A noble woman with cloud-like hair and a phoenix robe was leaning on the phoenix couch with her eyes closed. When she heard the voice of the head palace maid beside her, she slowly opened her eyes. The moment she opened her eyes, a cold light flashed through them. Over the years, this Zhenshi of Gojoseon can be considered considerate. He has sent so many people, but they were all stopped by me. If it weren't for the fact that Junshi of Gojoseon can't return to the capital, the one who is here today would not be his son." The head palace maid on the side did not dare to speak. The empress thought of something and said, "How is the child in the cold palace?" There had been no news of the child's death for so many years. Presumably, even if he was alive, he would be a cowardly and pitiful creature. Now, he came in handy. The head palace maid hesitated for a moment before saying, "A few years ago, when the little princess of the cold palace woke up, she was extremely arrogant and domineering. It is said that she took the ninth prince as a servant. Many people have heard that the little princess beat and scolded the ninth prince. They often see the ninth prince covered in scars. No one dares to interfere in the cold palace, so it is estimated that they are not living well." Little did they know that this was deliberately done by Gong Yimo in order to train Gong Dai's combat skills. The empress covered her mouth and laughed coldly. Her pair of long and narrow phoenix eyes narrowed slightly. "I almost forgot about that child, Xue Fei. Now, these two children, one is arrogant and brainless, the other mediocre and incompetent, but they still have some value. It's just that Junshi of Gojoseon's son is coming. I'm afraid that Xian Fei will not be able to sit still. I don't know if the child can escape this disaster." Although she said so, the empress's eyes were cold, without the slightest pity. She was afraid that she would use the little prince's death to plot against Lu Xian Fei. The head palace maid glanced at her and lowered her head, not daring to look again. Now, in the harem, the most favored one was Lu Xian Fei. At this time, Lu Xian Fei also heard the news. Her beautiful eyebrows frowned, and after a long time she said, "That child is so pitiful. He was tortured to death by the little princess. It's a pity that Junshi of Gojoseon never got to see his grandson." Saying so, she signaled to send her number 1 expert to make sure nothing goes wrong. Her subordinates quickly went to carry out the order. They did not expect Lu Xian Fei to be so cautious. Also, if she was not cautious, she would not have climbed to this position. At night, Gong Yimo was teaching Gong Dai to read. Because she woke up late in the day, Gong Yimo had become a complete night owl. She often went to bed in the middle of the night, and the later it was at night, the more energetic she became. Gong Dai could only accompany her. In the past 3 years, Gong Dai often had a feeling of enlightenment. He did not know why the royal sister knew so much, but he was sure that what the royal sister taught him was something that even the most knowledgeable grand tutor of the academy did not know. He would not ask the royal sister how she knew. Perhaps she was not immortal. Seeing that it was late, Gong Yimo was ready to let the people go to rest. However, Gong Dai was still in high spirits. Xian brought in some cakes for supper. Where did this cake come from? Gong Yimo asked vaguely, holding a piece in her mouth. Xian laughed softly. "I heard that it was the son of the newly promoted concubine Li in the palace. She is the emperor's biological cousin. They have had a good relationship since they were young. Moreover, it will be the Empress Dowager's birthday soon. 2 happy events have come at once. Therefore, the emperor is very happy and bestows rewards like water." Xian's voice was still soft, but she was popular in the cold palace. Many people wanted to know the news of Gong Yimo and Gong Dai through her, and she was happy to ask Gong Yimo. Hearing that the emperor had another child, Gong Dai's expression was a little gloomy. He did not know whether he was alive or dead, but over there, children were being born one after another. Gong Yimo patted him on the shoulder and smiled. "Look at the bright side. This child may be a good one." Gong Yimo was not a person who would curse others. Gong Dai could not help but raise his head to look at her. Gong Yimo sighed. "Imperial concubine Li is the emperor's cousin, which means she is a close relative, and the child of a close relative is likely to be born with a congenital disability." Her words made Gong Dai slightly stunned. At this time, Xian also interrupted. "So it's like that?" Before entering the palace, the aunt who treated me very well gave birth to a foolish child. She is her husband's cousin. As she said this, she seemed to think of something, and her expression was somewhat unbearable. Gong Dai frowned. In other words, if they are close relatives, they can't have children. He was 100% convinced by Gong Yimo's words, but he thought of something and asked, "Then what if they don't want children?" Gong Yimo smiled and patted him on the shoulder. Why go through so much trouble? There are so many women in the world. Do you have to choose close relatives? Her words made Gong Dai's heart tremble. Looking at the smiling face so close, Gong Dai inexplicably thought, what if it had to be close relatives? Chapter 16. Gong Ju was surprised by this idea. Before he could figure out what it was, Gong Yimo covered his mouth with a serious expression and glanced at the top of his head. Someone's here. Her small hands were soft and had the sweet smell of the wedding cake. Gong Dai was slightly dazed, and only then did he hear the sound of something breaking on the roof. The footsteps of those people were very light, and they quickly jumped down from the roof. At this critical moment, Gong Yimo suddenly made her move. She threw the dagger in her hand, and it directly hit the chest of one of the people outside the window. Seeing their companion dead, the other assassins who thought this was just a simple mission all changed their expressions. They did not know which faction was protecting this unfavored prince. They originally wanted to do it secretly, but now it seemed that it was not possible. The window broke and 3 or 4 people in black rushed in. Seeing one adult and 2 children in front of them, they all showed a surprised expression. However, Gong Dai would not give them a chance to react. He pulled out a narrow sword and stabbed at them. Gong Yimo pushed Xian Air aside and also joined the battle. The leader of the men in black never thought that the 2 children he thought were useless would have such skills. Thinking of Lu Xianfei, his eyes became fierce. Now that the son of Zhenshi of Gojoseon was coming, it was hard to guarantee that His Highness would not find out the truth in the future. It would definitely be a threat to Her Highness and His Highness. In front of him were just 2 children. Today he must kill these 2 hidden dangers in the cradle. Gong Yimo felt that something was wrong as soon as they started fighting. The people who came were all experts, and every move they made was aimed at Gong Dai. She did not know who was so cautious and so generous that they would not care about the consequences of killing a child. Gong Dai had never really fought with anyone before. At the beginning, it was very difficult, but gradually he got used to it. His small body flew, and he also had the strength to fight. The more they fought, the more the leader of the men in black was shocked. He did not know who taught these 2 children martial arts. They were so powerful. If this continued, he would fail the mission. Thus, he sent out a secret signal and once again engaged in battle with Gong Yimo. His mind was unprecedentedly focused, and it was hard to imagine that a 10-year-old girl could actually fight him without falling into a disadvantageous position. But it didn't matter. He had already sent a signal to gather the others. Tonight, these 2 children must be killed here. Gong Yimo naturally noticed the other party's actions. She was secretly anxious. If it was only these few people, she believed that she could definitely take them down. However, if there were more people, it would be troublesome. At this moment, she saw that Gong Dai's shoulder had been stabbed. She hurriedly swung her sword to block the attack for him, then grabbed him and threw him out of the window with all her might. She shouted without looking back, "I'll take care of this. Gong Dai, go find Imperial Father." To find Imperial Father? Gong Dai was just about to raise his sword and kill his way back when he heard Gong Yimo's voice. At this time, his shoulder had been stabbed and blood was flowing. Even so, he had never thought of looking for that man. Even if he died, he was not afraid of dying together with Gong Yimo. Seeing this, a man in black also wanted to leave and report to the inner palace, but he was stopped by Gong Yimo. Another man in black attacked him. Gong Yimo flew up and blocked the window by herself, looking like she could hold back 10,000 men by herself. The seriousness and concentration on her little face was something Gong Dai had never seen before. His heart suddenly tightened. If the situation was not so critical, how could Imperial Sister be so stubborn? Thinking of this, Gong Dai did not care about anything else and quickly ran to the most prosperous part of the palace. "Imperial Sister, you must wait for me. I will be back soon, very soon." The most prosperous part of the palace was Zhaoyang Hall. At this time, the emperor had a new son and was very happy. He ordered a 3-day banquet to be held for the whole world to celebrate. From afar, one could hear the sound of musical instruments and laughter. Amidst the clinking of glasses, the room was filled with magnificent clothes and bright lanterns, forming the most dazzling scene of prosperity. It was a strong contrast to the cold palace in the far west. Emperor Cheng was 45 years old now, but he lived like a prince all year round. He looked to be in his early 30s, with thick eyebrows and big eyes. He was tall with broad shoulders, and his imposing manner was vigorous. Only someone who had experienced the battlefield would have this kind of arrogance. This was the Son of Heaven, no one would doubt. At this time, he was lying on a concubine's lap, with a beauty fanning him on one side and a beauty feeding him on the other. As for himself, he looked at the dancing palace maids in the hall with a dispirited expression and yawned at an inappropriate time. The beauty fanning herself smiled and asked, "Is your Majesty tired?" Emperor Cheng, who had always been patient with beauties, sighed, "It's just boring." At this time, without waiting for the beauty to say anything, a white-haired eunuch hurried over and whispered something in his ear, causing the noble emperor to raise his eyebrows slightly. "Oh, I don't remember having a son." He whispered a few words. On the other side, there were many experts in the inner palace. Gong Dai could not get close to the core palace. Even if those people would not kill him because of his identity as a prince, it did not mean that they would not hurt him. The night of early spring brought with it traces of icy cold. Gong Dai was facing a group of imperial bodyguards wearing blue palace robes. The silver-white spearhead was pointed at him. Gong Dai could not help but tighten his grip on the narrow sword in his hand and shouted, "I am Imperial Father's 9th Prince Ju. I have an urgent matter to discuss with Imperial Father." The leader of the imperial bodyguards coldly snorted, "You can't enter without His Majesty's permission." A trace of anxiety flashed through Gong Dai's cold eyes. As long as he thought of Gong Yimo alone in the cold palace dealing with those assassins, and that those assassins had come for him, his heart was anxious and hateful. He did not waste any more words and directly raised his sword. The group of imperial bodyguards clearly did not expect that the little prince opposite them was also skilled in martial arts. Moreover, his martial arts were strong. They were ordered to stop here and quickly sent someone to report. But what they did not expect was that they could not stop the other party at all. A group of 12 people, except for one person who left, were not Gong Dai's opponent. Blood splattered everywhere. The guards realized that the other party was not showing any mercy at all. They hurriedly used their body protection to resist, but the gap was still the gap. Under Gong Ju's relentless attacks, they were gradually defeated. Not to mention resisting, it became difficult to even save their own lives. And this entanglement changed after Gong Dai killed the first person. There was a moment of stagnation in the air, and then there was an even more frenzied collision. At this time, they no longer cared whether the other party was a prince or not. If they wanted to live, they could only fight with all their might. Feeling the warm blood splattering on his body, Gong Dai's hands trembled slightly. He did not need to kill, but he was too anxious and too afraid. He was afraid that something would happen to the royal sister, so every move was fatal. In a short moment, 8 of the remaining 11 people were killed by him. It was simply crazy to kill imperial bodyguards in the imperial palace like this, and he was also injured. Half of his body was covered in blood, but he did not know if it was his own or someone else's. At this time, looking at the dead or half-dead bodies on the ground, he stood alone in a daze, as if he was dreaming. He looked at his hand, which was holding the hilt of his sword and was covered in blood. This was the first time he killed someone. The feeling of the sword and the knife cutting through the throat was clearly imprinted in his mind. Then, he looked up into the distance, his hand once again holding the narrow sword tightly, and hurriedly ran away. Time, if only time could slow down. Chapter 17. In order to enter Zhaoyang Palace, he had to pass through 3 gates: Cold Moon Gate, Hidden Dragon Gate, and Zetian Gate. At this time, he had just crossed the palace river and arrived at Cold Moon Gate when he heard the faint sound of music. He ran straight in that direction. He ran so fast that his lungs felt like they were on fire. He kept urging himself to run faster, faster. A gust of cold wind whistled and rain fell from the sky, covering the sky. The whole palace was so big and magnificent. but under the darkness and palace lanterns, it looked solemn and indifferent. Gong Dai was running like a leaf in a race of life and death. However, he was stopped again. This time, the people who stopped him were the same as before, palace guards. However, from their calm eyes, Gong Dai was secretly vigilant. These were definitely not ordinary guards. The Empress has decreed that those who enter without being summoned will be killed without mercy. These 3 cold words made Gong Dai's eyes flash with hostility. The Empress, he did not expect her to stop him. And these people were ordered by the Empress, so they will not be merciful to him. There were a total of 15 people, and they were well trained. It was enough to deal with a child. However, Gong Dai was not an ordinary child. He looked at the people in front of him and took a deep breath. Without saying a word, he raised the sword in his hand. The sword trembled slightly, as if it was about to taste blood and was looking forward to it. Come on, he will kill all those who obstruct him. When he was young, no one looked after him in the cold palace for 2 years. It made his character arrogant and ruthless. If he could kill 800 enemies, he did not mind sacrificing 1,000. It was precisely because of this ferocity that no one in the elite team of more than a dozen people was able to get close to him in the midst of a melee battle. The guards were secretly anxious because they also received a secret order from Lu Xianfei to kill the 9th prince. Gong Dai originally wanted to be careful, but when he thought of Gong Yimo and the cold palace being in danger, he went crazy and could not control himself. He became more and more proficient in using the sword, and his moves became more and more ruthless. The feeling of flesh being cut open and the threads twisting was truly fascinating. While they were fighting, he coldly looked in the direction of the lights in the distance, and a frightening chill flashed through his ink-black eyes. Why was it that even though they were both princes, they could chat and laugh in the throne room while he and his royal sister could only hide in a corner of the cold palace? Why did he have to rely on himself to snatch everything? At this moment, his black hair was flying in the wind, and his white robes were stained with blood. From afar, he looked like a blooming flower. He was supposed to be as pretty as Guanyin, but right now, his eyes were bloodshot and filled with killing intent. He was like a demon. As the blade slashed down, hot blood sprayed onto half of his white, jade-like face. His originally tightly pursed lips suddenly revealed a trace of a smile. If this was the path he wanted to take, for the sake of his royal sister, he would definitely take it. One day, whether it was the Empress, the prince, or even the emperor, he could decide whether to punish or forgive with a single thought. Exile or hid under the bed. For the time being, no one thought of her, and she managed to escape. At this time, people did not care about the lives of their servants, not to mention using her to threaten Gong Yimo. At this moment, the cold autumn courtyard was already in a mess. 3 out of the 4 people who came were already dead. Their fight had also gradually spread from the room to the courtyard. Gong Yimo twirled the long sword in his hand. He looked calm and unruffled, and even had the time to make sarcastic remarks. Looking at how you act on your own, you must be very important to your master. Unfortunately, does your master know how weak you are? You even need to find help to kill a child. Now, he was the only one left out of the 4 black-clothed men, but he was not afraid at all. He estimated that the others should be arriving soon. At that time, he would first kill the princess, and then kill the escaped prince. He was not worried that Gong Dai would escape. If the imperial palace was so easy to break into, the emperor would have died thousands of times. Perhaps he did not need to do anything, and the little prince would have died in the hands of those in the imperial harem. Looking at the little girl in front of him, Luomo felt a trace of admiration for no reason. At this moment, the other party was covered in blood, but she was talking to him with assurance. It was just a stall for time. Hearing the sound of footsteps approaching from afar, Luomo sighed and sneered. It seems that my people have arrived first. You are destined to die here today. Not long after, a small team of 12 people slowly walked out of the night and hid behind Luomo. Even if Luomo's face could not be seen, he could hear his pride. You still want to wait for the little prince to call for help? That's simply wishful thinking. Perhaps before the emperor knew, he had already been killed at the 3rd checkpoint. Now, he's probably already dead. If that is the case, you have underestimated the Emperor. Gong Yimo looked at the newly appeared black-clothed men with murderous eyes. She smiled tiredly. Is that so? Then let's see if you kill me first, or if he brings people to save me first. Lu Imo narrowed his eyes. Kill. 15 minutes later, in the entire Cold Moon Pass, except for Gong Dai, no one was standing up. Fine drizzles fell from the sky, mixed with blood, and dyed the palace river red. It should not be like this. There were 5,000 guards in the Imperial Palace, not including the Imperial Dragon Guards and the Secret Guards. However, no one came to stop him when he killed all these people. Gong Dai understood. His eyes shot toward Zhaoyang Palace like lightning. However, after taking a step, he knelt down on one knee and supported himself with his narrow sword. The pain and emptiness all over his body showed that he was exhausted. However, when he thought of Gong Yimo who was left in the cold palace, Gong Dai gritted his teeth and stood up. His black hair stuck to his forehead. Among the messy hair was his shockingly bright black eyes. He had to meet Imperial Father. After passing through Cold Moon Pass, he endured through Hidden Dragon Pass like he was bathed in blood. When he finally reached Zetian Pass, his small figure was completely covered in blood. At this moment, he stood proudly and stubbornly, looking at the people who blocked his path with hatred. Why did they block him? Why? It was a white-haired eunuch. Gong Dai remembered him. He was the #1 person by the Emperor's side, Changshi. At this moment, he sighed with a solemn expression. When he spoke again, it was as if he was coaxing a disobedient child. Greetings to your Highness the 9th Prince. May I know why your Highness the 9th Prince barged in without being summoned? Gong Dai lightly swung his narrow sword. Dark red blood splattered on the ground. He was standing here with a single breath. He was already an arrow at the end of its flight. At this moment, his eyes were red and he said in a hoarse voice, I urgently request to see Imperial Father. I hope Eunuch Gong can pass on the message. He looked earnestly at Changshi. He had no more time. He hoped that the other party would let him go. He believed that he was able to come here because of Imperial Father's instructions. Thus, Imperial Father should want to see him. However, Changshi shook his head and sighed. Please return to the Cold Palace, Your Highness the 9th Prince. His Majesty has decreed that today is a day of celebration. He will pardon Your Highness from the death penalty for barging into the palace. If there is a next time, you will be executed without mercy. Executed without mercy. These 4 words were infused with internal energy. They circled around Zetian Pass like a high wall pressing down, causing despair to rise in people's hearts. Chapter 18. Gong Dai's eyes were about to bleed. He stared at Changshi. Monstrous anger and unwillingness almost drowned him. This was the father he still had some longing for in his heart. On one hand, he was celebrating a newborn's birthday. On the other hand, he was telling his other son that he would not spare him. The royal family was ruthless, fickle, and unjust. Since that was the case, why did he have to take this step himself? To play around. Listening to the music that was already very clear in his ears, Gong Dai closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was no trace of pain in his eyes, only killing intent. Even if it meant death, he also wanted to see the Emperor. He did not believe that the Emperor would tolerate someone killing his children under his nose. Changshi did not expect Gong Dai to still have strength. He was a martial artist himself, and was also the #1 expert in the palace. How could he not see that Gong Dai was already an arrow at the end of its flight? Seeing the narrow sword coming at him, Changshi swung his horsetail whisk and said, Your Highness, you are not this servant's opponent. Please go. But Gong Dai, who had already entered a state of madness, could not hear him at all. There was only killing in his mind. Kill, kill. As long as he killed enough people, the Emperor would naturally come out to see him, even if he came out to execute him. Wind in nature was originally an extremely peaceful cultivation method, but the more Gong Dai used it, the more murderous it became. His limbs were sore and numb. He did not know if it was the rain or the blood that was blurring his eyes. The sword in his hand became heavier and heavier. Every time he swung it, it was as if he was carrying a heavy mountain. At this time, his heart was empty, as if it was missing a piece. He was really useless. He still dragged down the person he did not want to drag down the most. He could not even do something as simple as calling for reinforcements. How could he have the face to stay by the royal sister's side? This time, he was protected by the royal sister. What if next time, and the time after that? When he thought about how Gong Yimo would be in danger again because of him, Gong Dai could not forgive himself. How could he become stronger? He wanted to become stronger, even stronger. He had someone he wanted to protect. It was as if a stream of qi had entered his dantian. Gong Dai felt his entire body relax. He had actually broken through at this moment. Chang Shi, who was originally just responding, let out a strange eh. It was this moment of distraction that allowed Gong Dai to slash his arm. He was stunned. It had been more than 10 years, and he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be injured. However, Gong Dai was not satisfied with just stabbing him. What he wanted to do was to kill him. At this moment, a burst of deep laughter sounded out. Chang Shi immediately blocked the attack and retreated a dozen or so meters before kneeling and shouting, "Welcome, Your Majesty." "Your Majesty, Imperial Father?" Gong Dai suddenly felt an emptiness in his heart. His expression suddenly became dazed. Because the palace doors were wide open, the music of Zhaoyang Hall floated out clearly. At this moment, Gong Dai's body swayed and he almost knelt down. He forced himself to open his eyes wide to look. From afar, he saw the palace lanterns flickering. Between the light and shadow, a group of people walked towards him. At the forefront, a man was striding forward with a golden crown on his head. The golden dragon robe on his body shone brilliantly under the light of the lanterns. As if he had played enough, Emperor Gong strode to the front of the hall. At this moment, he stood on the steps with the other palace officials, while Gong Dai stood alone at the bottom of the steps. On one side, there was a cluster of flowers and brocade, wealth and splendor, while on the other side, there was a cold wind and bleak, covered with scars. "You are my 9th son?" Emperor Gong did not seem to remember the name of this child. He sneered, "You injured the imperial guards and forced your way into the forbidden palace. Could it be that you're not afraid of death?" His smile, as well as the haughty gazes of the imperial concubines, princes and princesses standing behind him, made Gong Dai feel humiliated for no reason. His small and thin body stood upright in the cold wind, and his hands were trembling. Those gazes that implied sarcasm and evil intentions. Gong Dai closed his eyes again. He had to endure. He was alone in this imperial palace. Even if it was for the sake of his royal sister, he had to endure. Thinking of this, his body went limp and he knelt on one knee. His head was raised high, and he stared at the bright yellow figure with a hoarse voice as he pleaded loudly, "I beg Imperial Father to save Royal Sister." The cold palace was attacked by assassins, and Royal Sister is in danger. "I beg Imperial Father to save her." He did not argue for himself, and he kept asking the Emperor to save his life. Gong Dai was so proud and stubborn. Even if he knelt on one knee, he was still unwilling to lower his proud head. The Emperor looked at him in amusement for a moment. He was really proud and unyielding. Unfortunately, the imperial palace did not need these things the most, so he did not say anything with pity in his eyes. The Emperor's pressure spread coldly. Even if he could not see his expression, Gong Dai could feel his ridicule. The Emperor looked down at him with such a supreme attitude, as if he was looking at an ant, or an ant that wanted to invade the imperial power. Gong Dai seemed to hear a woman's voice laughing at him. As if he was enlightened, at this moment, he understood. Gong Dai did not hesitate at all. He quickly lifted his clothes and knelt down on both knees, kowtowing to the ground. "I beg Imperial Father to save Royal Sister." He kowtowed on the steps in front of him. The sound was so loud that even the Emperor, who was on the steps, could hear it clearly. Every time he kowtowed, he shouted loudly, begging Imperial Father to save his life. His voice became more and more urgent, more and more sorrowful, as if he was weeping blood. Others could not see his expression, but they knew that he was kowtowing so hard. Soon, his forehead was bleeding, but he was not aware of it. It's okay. It's really okay. When he saw the emperor, he only asked him to save royal sister's life and death, not to mention kowtowing without dignity. Even if he broke all his proud bones and begged on the ground, it's okay. Looking at his child kowtowing and pleading at the bottom of the steps, Emperor Cheng's heart of stone was slightly moved. The previous unhappiness because of Gong Dai killing people gradually dissipated. He even wanted to know what kind of child made him beg for help so desperately. Emperor Cheng narrowed his eyes slightly and finally opened his mouth. Oh, I actually have a daughter in the cold palace? What's her name? His tone was slow and hateful. When Gong Dai heard it, he was stunned. He no longer kowtowed, but straightened up. Blood flowed down his cheeks, and his hand on the side clenched into a fist. He looked at the high and mighty emperor with a deep and complicated expression. His voice trembled because of the chill in his heart. Imperial father, in the past, you gave royal sister the name Yimo to show your willingness to help imperial concubine Shui. Now, imperial concubine Shui has only been dead for 7 years. Have you even forgotten this name? His strong unwillingness, sarcastic and angry words made Emperor Cheng's smile slowly freeze on his face. For a moment, his expression became extremely serious. On the other side, the Empress's eyes were filled with murderous intent and unconcealable jealousy. An emperor of a generation, helping others in difficult times, then where does that leave her, the Empress? After a long time, Emperor Cheng chuckled. Interesting, interesting. Speaking of which, I really want to know who dared to assassinate my child under my nose. After saying that, his cold eyes shot to Changxi. Prepare the sedan. I want to go to the cold palace in person. As for the others, follow me to see. Chapter 19. His words made Gong Dai suddenly relax. He almost fainted, but he wanted to return to Gong Yimo's side. He had to be faster than these people. He couldn't even go first. The suppression and coldness of the imperial power once again left a deep impression on Gong Dai. Looking at those slightly dissatisfied nobles who had to accept the order to get on the palanquin, Gong Dai didn't understand why they had to be brought along. Fortunately, Changxi's movements were very fast, and the people carrying the palanquin were all imperial dragon guards. Their lightness skill moved forward, which made some of the women exclaim. The rain suddenly poured down. Old Lady Su of the Cold Palace scrambled to her feet. Why did so many nobles come to the Cold Palace without saying a word? Why didn't anyone inform her? At this time, the rain had stopped. The whole Cold Palace was so dark and damp. Every corner seemed to be rotten and moldy, and the smell was very unpleasant. Mama Su trembled and crawled in front of the Emperor's footsteps. She didn't move even when the water wet her clothes. The Emperor didn't even look at her. He led the way and went straight to Cold Chuyuan. The blood had begun to coagulate. As soon as everyone's feet stepped into the courtyard with the light, all kinds of suppressed voices rose and fell. Many people's faces became extremely ugly. At this time, there were 7 or 8 people in black lying in the small courtyard. The smell of blood couldn't be dispersed, and the blood mixed with the rain. At first glance, the ground was so dark that it looked like a pool of blood. In the middle of the courtyard, a little girl sat on a square stone platform. The sudden appearance of the light made her body tremble slightly. At her feet was the dying Lu Mo. Just now, when he heard the imperial presence from afar, Lu Mo's expression changed. He finally panicked. He didn't expect the emperor to come, and come so quickly. So he unwillingly let his subordinates retreat, and he himself stayed behind. In the end, he looked at Gong Yimo with uncontrollable anger. Such a chance. He actually failed to kill her. Unwilling to give up, Lu Mo stabbed his sword towards Gong Yimo's shoulder. He wanted to take advantage of the fact that she was dodging and quickly leave. Who would have thought that the heavily injured Gong Yimo would not dodge when she heard his footsteps? He didn't know where she got her strength from, but she threw away her sword and let the opponent's sword stab into her shoulder. She didn't say a word as she grabbed the opponent's sword with one hand and stabbed Lumo's abdomen with the other. He had forced him to stay. It sounded simple, but it was actually extremely vicious. If Gong Dai had come a moment later, the one who would have survived would not have been her. Seeing Lu Imo fall, she pulled out the sword from her shoulder with her bloody hand. Her figure flashed, and she sat down on the stone platform. This was what everyone saw when they came in. This scene caused Lu Xianfei to scream out loud. Her pair of big eyes instantly filled with tears. She glared at Gong Yimo hatefully. Gong Yimo caught the venomous look in her eyes and laughed softly. Royal sister. Gong Ju was about to step forward, but was stopped by Chang Shi. Under the bright palace lanterns, Gong Yimo's long hair hung loosely over her shoulders. Her ice-cold face hung low, and her body was covered in blood. Against the continuous rain, and the ground was littered with corpses. She suddenly raised her head and smiled, but everyone present trembled with fear. At this time, she kicked the person next to her. Look, everyone is here. Is your master inside? Lu Imo weakly looked up at the crowd, but he refused to speak. The harem was the Empress's duty. She saw that Lu Xianfei's expression was not right, and quickly said, "This person is the assassin? Princess, quickly hand him over to Mother, and Mother will give you justice." She said it with a strong sense of righteousness, but in her heart she was quickly calculating. Could she use this assassin to make Lu Xianfei suffer a big loss? As soon as her voice fell, Lu Xianfei became anxious. She softly threw herself into the Emperor's arms and said, "Your Majesty, the princess killed so many assassins alone. Is she a demon? Your Majesty, I'm scared." If it was in the past, the Emperor would have calmed her down and arrested her. But he was also shocked by the scene in front of him. This young girl sitting alone in the midst of the blood and flesh. Is she really Xuelian's child? Gong Yimo looked up at him, and the smile on her face was even more insincere. She kicked Lu Imo again. "The Emperor is here. Don't you want to say something?" At this time, Lu Imo spat out a mouthful of blood. "You better kill me, or you will regret it." The Empress was anxious. "Princess, you should hand the criminal over to Mother. Mother will definitely find out who is behind this." Hearing this, Lu Imo sneered. Lu Xianfei, on the other hand, said softly, "The Empress is really anxious. I think that the princess's martial arts skills are more suspicious than the assassin's." At this time, the Emperor recovered and slowly said, "Come, take the criminal. Interrogate him severely." At this time, Gong Yimo raised her small hand slightly. "No need to trouble yourself." With that said, the sword in her hand hummed, and with a stab, blood splashed on her face. She carelessly wiped her face and numbly looked up at the crowd. This one look, many of the women screamed again and again, and some even fainted. She didn't care how ugly the Empress and concubines' faces were. She just blinked and looked at the Emperor, and said in a flattering tone, "Father, this person wants to kill me. I will kill him myself. Is it not too much?" The bystanders all sucked in a breath of cold air. Killing people without batting an eyelid at such a young age. Everyone looked at this princess with fear and dread. Even Emperor Chang couldn't speak for a long time. The more he looked, the more he felt that this little girl didn't have the slightest shadow of concubine Shui, but a bit like him. At this time, all the resentment, suspicion, and fear fell on the blood-stained sword of Gong Yimo. She felt it, and raised her head and chin to stare back one by one. Perhaps her appearance at this time was too cruel and terrible. No one dared to look at her. She smiled at Gong Dai's direction, but now her face was covered with blood, and her smile was even more ferocious. It must have left an indelible shadow in everyone's heart. No one knew why she did this. Only Gong Ju understood her intentions. He felt as if his chest was being torn apart, and he felt a burning pain in his chest. Finally, he broke away from Chang Shi, strode out of the crowd, and stood in front of Gong Yimo. Gong Yimo frowned, and her tone was unprecedentedly harsh. "Back off." Gong Dai shook his head with a cold face. "I won't go." He saw all the covetous eyes, and he knew that tonight's matter couldn't be covered up. So the royal sister did it deliberately. She wanted everyone's eyes to be locked on her. So she was arrogant, and even killed in front of the Emperor. Gong Dai clearly saw the royal sister's hand trembling because of exhaustion. She was far from being as relaxed as she appeared. She was covered in blood, and most of it was her own. But even so, she was still wholeheartedly scheming for him. This knowledge made his heart ache. Chapter 20. Gong Yimo was very clear that since Gong Dai was able to see the emperor, and the emperor had rushed here so quickly, he would definitely not take her life. Since that was the case, she might as well be the one to take the lead. Thus, she coldly stared at Gong Dai's back. Go away. Gong Dai's small and blood-stained figure stood firmly in front of her, without even turning his head. Royal sister, I will not leave. In such a cold night, Gong Dai's actions made the physically and mentally exhausted Gong Yimo slightly warm. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. Just as Gong Yimo was thinking of how to get rid of Gong Dai, the empress angrily shouted, Come, arrest the 7th princess. Killing in front of the emperor is a serious crime. She cannot be forgiven. Gong Yimo was the 7th princess. This was the first time she knew about it. Gong Dai heard this and coldly looked at the empress. At the same time, Lu Xianfei, who was in the emperor's arms, softly said, Tonight was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but the 9th prince killed his way into the inner palace. This is really inauspicious. If a prince breaks the law, he will be punished the same as a commoner. If he is not severely punished, it will be difficult to convince the public. The voice of a minister came from the crowd. So young and so strong, very suspicious, so cruel and merciless. If we do not get rid of him now, he will harm the country in the future. Behind the emperor, there were more than 20 people, at this time, one after another, throwing alarmist words at the 2 children as if they were free. Gong Dai listened to those evasive and vicious words. His body trembled. Obviously, they only wanted to protect themselves, but there were so many people who wanted to kill them, never to rise again. Why? He felt cold for no reason, his eyes firmly memorizing the faces of these people in his heart. These people who wanted to assassinate him, maliciously slander him, and hurt the royal sister. All of them. He will not let any of them go. And this world was not as warm and beautiful as the royal sister said. It was dirty and chaotic. Only slaughter. Only then could he be cleansed. All the negative emotions seemed to be about to explode, causing the murderous aura in Gong Dai's body to boil like magma. But all the evil disappeared the moment Gong Yimo pulled his sleeve. At this time, Gong Chung slowly opened his mouth. Sure enough, once he opened his mouth, no one dared to make a fuss. Where is the head of the cold palace? Su Mama knew that a disaster was imminent and quickly knelt down in front of Gong Chung. But Gong Chung didn't even look at her. My child was assassinated for no reason. You failed to take care of the cold palace. Men, beat him to death. As soon as his low voice fell, someone immediately covered Mama Su's mouth and executed her in front of everyone. She was tied up and placed on the bench that the guards had brought over. Soon, there was a muffled sound of flesh being hit. After a few beatings, Mama Su was beaten to a bloody pulp. Her mouth was gagged and she let out a beast-like whimper. Her eyes were wide open with resentment, and she died in a short time. This scene made everyone's heart tremble. They didn't have the heart to think about what the emperor meant by this move. The fresh smell of blood made the courtyard full of 30 to 40 people silent. Everyone shut their mouths, including Lu Xianfei, who was hiding in the emperor's arms. Her body was stiff, and she didn't dare to speak again. As for you, for some reason, Gong Chung found that his stern eyes, which were enough to make all the ministers afraid, were a little weak in front of the little girl's cunning eyes. He glared again. As for you, killing in front of the emperor is a capital offense. Forcing people into the forbidden palace is also a capital offense. What do you have to say? Hearing this, Gong Dai was so angry that his whole body was trembling. Feeling that Gong Dai was about to explode, Gong Yimo was shocked. She quickly pulled Gong Dai's small body into her arms and then looked up at the emperor with a smile. Imperial Father's words are wrong. Imperial Father's name is illustrious. His martial arts are the best in the world. As Imperial Father's daughter, when the enemy came to attack, I didn't show weakness, nor did I run away. Instead, I killed the enemy with my own hands. I made Imperial Father's name known. What's wrong with that? She swept her sharp eyes across the crowd. As for forcing people into the Forbidden Palace, Gong Yimo paused and suddenly coughed up a trace of blood. Her hand hugged the stiff gong die even tighter. After a moment, she looked up and smiled. Someone killed your children under your nose, treating the imperial power and you as nothing. This daughter couldn't bear to see Imperial Father being deceived by evil people. What's wrong with risking my life to see you? Emperor Gong was amused by her sharp tongue. He wanted to refute, but looking at the two children in front of him who were covered in blood snuggling together and arguing with him, his tone couldn't be harsh. In that case, what do you think Shin should do? He, the invincible ruler of the world, was actually asking for a little girl's opinion at this time. Gong Yimo's eyes lit up as she looked at him. Her voice, which was originally weak, immediately became full of energy. I think Father Emperor should reward me. Her words made the people present sigh, but Gong Yimo wasn't afraid. She was betting. She was betting that Emperor Gong was on her side by killing the chicken to warn the monkey. And Gong Dai, who was being hugged by her, his whole mouth and nose knocked on Gong Yimo's bleeding shoulder, and the smell of blood filled the air. She seemed to feel no pain and was wholeheartedly fighting for their survival. When the warm blood flowed into Gong Dai's mouth, he cried silently for the first time. When his imperial mother passed away, he was too young to cry. When he was banished to the cold palace, his situation fell from the sky to the ground. When he was bullied, he didn't cry. He always remembered that he was a prince and had to abide by the dignity and dignity. But now, he, a dignified prince, was firmly protected in the arms of the royal sister who was only 1 year older than him. He cried. He was so weak and useless. What he brought was only the disaster of slaughter. Royal sister always said that he was still young and always took it for granted to protect him. She never complained, but forgot that she was also a child. There was so much blood that even wet his lapel. Did she hurt? Did she hurt? Seeing that Emperor Gong didn't speak, the Empress became anxious. This is simply sophistry. Your Majesty, if you really let her go, it will be difficult to convince the public in the future. Her words hit the key point, making Emperor Gong frown again. At this time, Gong Yimo already felt dizzy. All the pain was slowly numbing. She knew that it was the result of excessive blood loss, but she still held on and sneered. The law? Imperial Father, you are the law. Before the minister could refute these arrogant and despotic words, Gong Yimo continued to speak. She looked at Emperor Gong with eyes full of seriousness. As the highest existence in the dynasty, the law you make is used to restrain others. If you are included in this, then what is the difference between the emperor and the common people? The person who makes the rules is above the law. You should be the most just and freewheeling person in the world. Your will is above everything. These words could be said to be shocking. She took a long breath and finally said weakly and aggrievedly, "Just say it. Now, are you willing to reward me?" Chapter 21. Everyone looked at each other in dismay, their eyes filled with disbelief. This was simply the biggest joke in the world. Not only did she not admit to killing someone in front of the emperor, she even wanted to be rewarded. After a long silence, Emperor Gong suddenly burst out laughing. He laughed so happily that no one dared to refute Gong Yimo's words at this time. It seemed that he had not been this happy for a long time. His eyebrows were full of joy. Such a smart and intelligent child. He really could not help but like her. You're right. I am the law. I'll reward whoever I want to. Changshi. This servant is here. Pass down my decree. 7th princess will be conferred the title of Chaoyang Princess, Wuji Palace. 9th prince will be conferred the Taihe Palace and move out of the Cold Palace from today onwards. This servant obeys the decree. Changshi sucked in a breath of cold air in his heart. Wuji Palace was the place where the emperor lived when he was still a prince, but he actually gave it to 7th princess and conferred the title of Chaoyang Princess. Presumably, when this decree was passed down, Many people would not be able to sleep tonight. Not to mention how jealous the people accompanying them were. Gong Dai was not unhappy at all. In his opinion, the place with Gong Yimo was the best place. He did not want to leave at all. Hearing the emperor's decree, Gong Yimo let out a sigh of relief. She smiled proudly at Gong Dai, who was close at hand. Just as she was about to say something, her vision turned black and she fainted. Just now, she was holding on with a single breath, but now that she won, she could no longer hold on. Royal sister. Gong Dai was frightened and wanted to hug her, but he was also seriously injured. How could he hug her? The two of them fell to the ground together. Looking at her lifeless appearance, Gong Dai only felt that the world suddenly turned scarlet red. If she could no longer open those eyes, if she could no longer smile at him, then what was the use of fighting for everything? Gong Dai half-hugged her. His eyes became redder and redder. The emperor was anxious and quickly frowned. Imperial physician, go. Summon the imperial physician to the palace. The surrounding people were in a mess and hurriedly left. However, Gong Dai did not seem to hear anything. He only saw Gong Yimo's pale lips and weak face. The blood on her face had scabbed and was being wiped away by him bit by bit. Royal sister, Gong Yimo. This person was his everything. Not to mention how much Gong Dai's heart ached. When Imperial Physician Dan saw the state Gong Yimo was in, he couldn't care less about the etiquette between men and women anymore. If this dragged on, he might not even be able to keep his life. Gong Chung was even more shocked. There were a total of 12 fatal wounds on Gong Yimo's body. It was hard to imagine how a 10-year-old child could endure the pain of fainting and negotiate with him. That domineering little face, could it be that she did not know pain? Gong Chung felt that even he couldn't do this when he was 10 years old. If Gong Yimo was a boy, he was afraid that he would have a headache. But now, seeing that she was so weak, Gong Chung only felt distressed. When Imperial concubine Shui died, he treated Gong Yimo as a bastard and directly banished her to the cold palace. It was not that he did not regret it later, but that feeling was very faint. The palace was too big, and the death of a child was nothing at all. He never thought that this child would appear in front of him so strongly again. It shocked him, softened his heart, and even made him unable to punish her. In the end, she was as stubborn as her mother, but compared to her mother, she was much more outstanding. Gong Dai followed Gong Yimo throughout the process. He did not listen to the emperor's orders. The emperor was soft-hearted. He and Gong Yimo had depended on each other for many years, so he let him be. So, he saw with his own eyes how the imperial physician tore apart her clothes and treated her like a rag doll. Those deep and shallow scars, every single one of them had been left behind because of him. She was so beautiful. Why would someone in this world be willing to be so cruel to her? The whole treatment process was like death by 1,000 cuts to Gong Dai. He held Gong Yimo's hand tightly. Usually, she would be delicate for a long time when she was bitten by an insect and needed him to coax her. She was extremely afraid of pain, and even a small injury would be known to everyone. Gong Dai really couldn't imagine how painful it was for her to suffer so many injuries. If possible, he hoped that all these injuries would be transferred to his own body, so that the guilt and heartache in his heart would be less. The imperial physician saw that Gong Dai only casually applied some medicine and was very dissatisfied. "Your Highness, your wounds need to be rebandaged." Gong Dai did not even spare him a glance. He only looked at her face that was even paler after washing. He reached out to touch her face to make sure that she was still alive. She was his whole world. After the Empress returned to the palace, she angrily smashed everything in front of her. She was not reconciled. That bastard. It was fine if her mother could get the Emperor's favor, but why could a bastard like her also get the Emperor's favor? Chaoyang Princess. Why could a bastard be called Chaoyang Princess, while her daughter, the daughter of the Empress, was only given the title of Princess Qingze? She was not satisfied. She was not satisfied. When the crown prince came in, he saw the floor full of debris and the silent palace servants. He shook his head and said to the Empress, "Why is Imperial Mother so angry?" In his opinion, the one who should be more angry should be Lu Xianfei, who lost a good general. Why was his mother so angry? Seeing him, The Empress' anger subsided a little. "Che, come here." Gong Che obediently walked over. At the age of 14, Gong Che had a pair of very gentle eyes. He waved to the other palace servants, and they quickly retreated, leaving only the mother and son to talk. Looking at Gong Che's face that grew more and more handsome as he grew up, the Empress felt a little relieved. Her son did not look like her, nor did he look like the Emperor, but he was gentle, honest, and knowledgeable. Why couldn't she get the Emperor's favor with such an excellent son? He favored Longue Fei, Lucien Fei's child. But why did he treat that bastard Gong Yimo differently as well? Thinking about it, her expression became twisted again. Just now, Gong Che followed behind the Empress and also witnessed everything. He thought for a moment and asked, "Imperial Mother, are you angry with Ninth Brother?" In his opinion, a prince was far more threatening than a princess. The Empress snorted. An unfavored prince was not in her eyes. Imperial Mother is angry with that bastard. What right does she have? After saying that, the Empress felt that she had misspoken and slightly frowned. Because in order to save the Emperor's face, she killed all the people who knew that Gong Yimo was not the Emperor's child. There were no more than 5 people who knew. Gong Che did not think so much, but the Empress's words made him think of that proud figure, and he could not help but feel a little absent-minded. He had seen so many daughters of aristocratic families, and most of them were gentle and elegant, or naive and cute. He had thought that all women in the world were like this, and that he liked these gentle ladies. He had never thought that there would be a day when such a person would appear in his world so powerfully and leave a lingering impression in his mind. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.